1. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There was once a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago, and now there was just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a grown of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and died up along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer in the daytime, temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade. If you can find any shade, there's not much shade in a big dry lake. The only trees are 2 old oaks in the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the 2 trees, and a log cabin against behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks and holes dug by the campers. There was a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you, usually. Getting bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die, usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or even a small rattlesnake. Then he will get to spend a day or 2 recovering in his tent, instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. But you don't want to be bitten by a yellow spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death, always. If you get bitten by a yellow spotted lizard, you might as well go into the shade of the oak trees and lie in the hammock. There's nothing anyone can do to you anymore. The reader can probably asking, why does... Chapter 2. The reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn them into a good boy. That was the some people's thought. Stanley Yenlitz was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He had never been to camp before. Chapter 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver in a seat around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, a box of stationery his mother had given him. He promised to write to her at least once a week. He looked out of the window, although there wasn't much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was just going away to camp for a while, just like rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend animals were at camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he had them play soccer with a marble. Other times he'd run obstacle courses or go bungee jumping off the table, tried to boat broken rubber bands. Now, Stanley tried to pretend he was going to camp fun and games. Maybe he'd make some friends, as he thought. At least, he'd get to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at his middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teacher sometimes made cruel comments about it without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Mrs. Bell, taught ratios. As an example, he chose the heaviest kid in the class and the lightest kid in the class, and made them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Mrs. Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3 to 1. Unaware of how much embarrassment she had caused both of them, Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in the seat and wondered how he'd fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all because of that no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they would always blame Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig and one-legged gypsy. Then she put a curse on him and all his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt to be good to be able to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place in the wrong time. He looked out the window in the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of the telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruff voice softly singing to him. If only, the woodpecker sighs. The bark of the tree was a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely. He cries on the moon, if only, if only. It was a song his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moon. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you have to have 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had lots of perseverance. Once he started a project, he would work on it for years, often going days without sleep. He just never got any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley would hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in this family had always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats, his name was spelled frontward and backward. So they kept naming their son Stanley, and Stanley was the only child that was the only other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learned from failure. But perhaps this was some part of curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt to do every time their hopes were crushed. Not every day Yelnats had been a failure. Stanley's mother had often pointed out whenever Stanley and his father became too discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such time, she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw Kissing Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would now be living in a mansion on the beach in California. Instead, they were crammed in a tiny apartment that smelled of burning rubber and foot odor. If only the apartment smelled the way it did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when they first found out the great-grandfather was robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. True, he would have preferred living on the beach in California, but it wasn't kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barlow wasn't actually Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool, but she only kissed the man she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to have survived, Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arm. Welcome to Camp Green Lake, said the driver. Stanley struck the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. Chapter 4. Stanley felt somewhat dazed as the guard unlocked his handcuffs and led him off the bus. He had been on the bus for over 8 hours. Be careful, the bus driver said as Stanley walked down the steps. Stanley wasn't sure if the bus driver meant for him to be careful going down the steps or he was telling him to be careful at Camp Green Lake. Thanks for the ride, he said. His mouth was dry and his throat hurt. He stepped onto the hard, dry dirt. There was a band of sweat around his wrist where the handcuffs had been. The land was barren and desolate. He could see a few run-down buildings from his tent. Farther away there was only cabin beneath 2 tall trees. Those trees were the only plant life he could see. They weren't even weeds. The guard led Stanley into a small building. A sign on the front said, "You are entering Camp Green Lake, Juvenile Correctional Facility." Next to it was another sign that declared that it was a violation of Texas Penal Code to bring guns, explosive weapons, drugs, or alcohol into the premises. As Stanley read the sign, he could only help but think, well, duh. The guard led Stanley into the building, where he felt someone welcome relief of air conditioning. A man was sitting on his feet up on a desk. He turned his head and Stanley and the guard entered, but otherwise didn't move. Even though he was inside, he wore sunglasses and a cowboy hat. He also had a can of soda, and the sight of it made Stanley even more aware of his own thirst. He waited until the bus guard gave the man some papers to sign. That's a lot of sunflower seeds, the bus guard said. Stanley noticed a burlap sack filled with sunflower seeds on the floor next to the desk. I quit smoking last month, the man in the cowboy hat. He had a tattoo of the rattlesnake on his arm. It was a sign of his name. The snake's rattle seemed to wiggle. I used to smoke a pack a day, and now I eat a sack of these every week. The guard laughed. There must have been a small refrigerator behind his desk, because the man in the cowboy hat produced 2 more cans of soda. For a second, Stanley hoped that one might be for him, but the man gave one to the guard, and it said the other one was for the driver. 9 hours here, and now 9 hours back, the guard grumbled. What a day. Stanley thought about the long, miserable bus ride and felt a little sorry for the guard and the bus driver. The man in the cowboy hat spat sunflower seed shells into the waste paper basket. When he walked down the desk to Stanley, "My name is Mr. Sir," he said. "Whenever you speak to me, you must call me by my name. Is that clear?" Stanley hesitated. Yes, Mr. Sir," he said, though he couldn't imagine that was the only man's name. "You're not in the Girl Scouts anymore," Mr. Sir said. Stanley had to remove his clothes in front of Mr. Sir, who made sure he wasn't hiding anything. He was given 2 sets of clothes and a towel. Each set consisted of a long-sleeve orange jumpsuit, an orange t-shirt, and yellow socks. Stanley wasn't sure if the socks had become yellow originally. He had also given white sneakers, an orange cap, and a canteen made of heavy plastic, which unfortunately was empty. The cap had a piece of cloth sewn to the back of it for neck protection. Stanley got dressed. The clothes smelled like soap. Mr. Sir told him he should wear one set to work and one set for relaxation. Laundry was done every 3 days. On that day, his work clothes would be washed. Then the other set would become his work clothes, and he would get clean clothes to wear while resting. You are to dig one hole each day, including Saturdays and Sundays. Each hole must be 5 feet deep, 5 across in every direction. Your shovel must be measuring stick. Breakfast is served at 4:30. Stanley must have looked surprised, because Mr. Sir went on to explain that he started early to avoid the hottest part of the day. No one is going to babysit you, he added. The longer it takes you to dig, the longer you'll be out in the sun. If you dug up anything interesting, you are to report it to me or any other counselor. When you finish, the rest of the day is yours. Stanley nodded to show he understood. This isn't Girl Scout camp, said Mr. Sir. He checked Stanley's backpack and allowed him to keep it. Then he held Stanley outside into a blazing heat. Take a good look around you, Mr. Sir said. What do you see? Stanley looked across the vast wasteland. The air seemed much thick in the hay and dirt. Not much, he said, and then hesitantly said, Mr. Sir. Mr. Sir laughed. You see any guard towers? No. How about an electric fence? No, Mr. Sir. There's no fence at all, is there? No, Mr. Sir. You want to run away? Mr. Sir asked him. Stanley looked back at him, unsure what he meant. If you want to run away, go ahead. Start running. I'm not going to stop you. Mr. Stanley didn't know what kind of game Mr. Sir was playing. I see you're looking at my gun. Don't worry. I'm not going to shoot you. He tapped his holster. This is for yellow-spotted lizards. I wouldn't waste a bullet on you. I'm not going to run away, Stanley said. Good thinking, said Mr. Sir. Nobody runs away from here. We don't need a fence. You know why? Because we've got the only water for 100 miles. You want to run away? You'll be a buzzard food in 3 days. Stanley could see some kids dressed in orange and carrying shovels dragging themselves towards the tents. You thirsty? Asked Mr. Sir. Yes, Mr. Sir, Stanley said gratefully. Well, you better get used to it. You're going to be thirsty for the next 18 months. Chapter 5. There were 6 large great tents. Each one had a black letter on it. A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselor slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D-tent. Mr. Pendensky was his counselor. My name is easy to remember, said Mr. Pendensky, as he shook his hand with Stanley just outside the tents. 3 even words. Pen, dance, key. Mr. Sir returned to his office. Mr. Pendensky was younger than Mr. Sir, but not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close that it was almost bald, but his face was covered in a thick, curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Mr. Sir isn't really so bad, said Mr. Pendensky. He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule in Camp Greed Lake: don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, Mr. Pendensky said. I understand that you made some bad mistakes in your life, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but you never say you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try to tell his counselor why he was innocent. He figured that everyone probably had said that, and he didn't want Mr. Pendensky to think he had a bad attitude. I'm going to help you turn your life around, said his counselor, but you're going to have to help too. Can I count on your help? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Mr. Pendensky said, good, and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys each carrying a shovel were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendensky called to them. Rex, Alan, I want you two to say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of their team. The boys glanced weirdly at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat. Their faces were so dirty that it looked like Stanley for a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other black. What happened to Barf Bag? Asked the black kid. Lewis is still in the hospital, said Mr. Pendensky. He won't be returning. He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hand or introduce themselves like gentlemen. Hi, the white kid grunted. That's Alan, said Mr. Pendensky. My name is not Alan, the boy said. It's Squid, and that's X-Ray. Hey, said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. Mr. Pendensky told Alan to go to the rec hall and turn the other boy to meet Stanley. Then he led him inside the tent. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet and one next to it. Which was Lewis's cot? Mr. Pendensky asked. Barf Bag slept here, said X-Ray, kicking at one of the beds. All right, Stanley, that'll be yours, said Mr. Pendensky. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Barf Bag. 7 crates were stacked into 2 piles on one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and towel in what he used to Barf Bag's crate, and at the bottom of the stack had been 3 in it. Stood to turn to the other 4 boys. First 3 were introduced to Mr. Pendensky as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Pendensky. However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names the society will recognize them by. When they return home, become useful and hard-working members of society. It wasn't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pendensky. He tapped the rim of his glasses. I can see you. I can see inside you. Mom, you're got a big fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Badunski and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name's Zero? Asked Mr. Badunski. Because there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Badunski smiled at him, as if to make you feel better to call me Mom. Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm dependent on you. Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain that they needed to keep their home sanitary. You were all new here once, said Mr. Badunski, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Badunski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone. He was so thirsty that he felt he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him. Do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley in the collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up at him, terrified. Where's the water spigot on the wall in the shower stall? Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. He watched the boy turn and walk away. He couldn't get the life of him to figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having to sleep in a cot that was used by somebody named Barfbag. Maybe it was a term of respect. Stanley took a shower, if you call it that, ate dinner, if you could call it that, and went to bed, if you could call it his smelly and scratchy cot of bed. Because of the scarcity of water, each camper was only allowed a 4-minute shower. It took Stanley nearly that long to get used to the cold shower. Here was no knob for hot water. He kept stepping into, then jumping back from the spray, until the water shut off automatically. He managed to use a bar of soap, which was just as well, because he wouldn't have time to rinse off the suds. Dinner was some kind of stewed meat and vegetables. The meat was brown, and the vegetables once again been green. Everything tasted pretty much the same. He ate it all, and used a slice of white bread to mop up the juice. Stanley had never been one to leave food on the plate, no matter how it tasted. What'd you do? One of the campers asked him. At first, Stanley didn't know what he meant. They sent you here for a reason. Oh, he realized, I stole a pair of sneakers. The other boy thought it was funny. Stanley wasn't sure why. Maybe their crimes were a lot worse than stealing shoes from a store, or they were on someone's feet, asked Squid. Neither, Stanley answered. They belonged to Clyde Livingston. Nobody believed him. Sweet feet, said X-Ray. Yeah, right. No way, said Squid. Now, as Stanley lay on his cot, he thought of this kind of in a funny way. Nobody believed him when he had said it was innocent. Now, when he had stole them, nobody believed him either. Clyde Sweetfeet Livingston was a famous baseball player. He led in the American League in stolen bases over the last 3 years. He was also the only player in history to ever hit 4 triples in one game. Stanley had a poster of him hanging on the wall of his bedroom. He used to have a poster anyway. He didn't know where it was now, and it had been taken by the police and was used as evidence of his guilt in the courtroom. Clyde Livingston also came to court. In spite of everything, when Stanley found out Sweetfeet was going to be there, he was actually excited about the prospect of meeting his hero. Clyde Livingston testified that they were his sneakers, and he found that he had donated them to help raise money for a homeless shelter. He said he couldn't imagine the kind of horrible person would steal from homeless children. That was the first part of for Stanley. His hero thought he was no good, dirty, rotten thief. As Stanley tried to turn over in his cot, he was afraid he was going to collapse under all the weight. He barely fit in it. When he finally managed to roll over in his own stomach, the smell was so bad that he had to turn over again and try sleeping on his back. The cot smelled like smile or milk. Though it was night, the air was still very warm. Armpit was snoring 2 cots away. Back at school, a boy named Derek Dunn used to torment Stanley. The teachers never took Stanley's complaints seriously because Derek was so much smaller than Stanley. Some teachers even started finding it amusing a little kid like Derek would pick on someone as big as Stanley. On the day Stanley was arrested, Derek had taken Stanley's notebook and, after a long game of come and get it, finally dropped it in the toilet in the boys' restroom. By the time Stanley retrieved it, he had missed his bus and had to walk home. It was while he was going home, carrying his wet notebook, and the prospect of having a copy of his ruined pages that all sneakers fell from the sky. It was walking home, the sneakers fell from the sky, he had told the judge. One hit me on the head. It had hurt, too. He finally exactly fallen from the sky. He had just walked from under a freeway overpass and the shoe hit him on the head. Stanley took it from the sign. His father had been trying to figure out a way to recycle old sneakers, and suddenly a pair of new sneakers fell on top of him, starting out of nowhere like a gift from God. Naturally, he had no way of knowing who they belonged to, like Clyde Livingston. In fact, the shoes were anything but sweet. Whoever had worn them had a bad case of foot odor. Stanley couldn't help but think there was something special about the shoes, and they would somehow provide the key to his father's invention. This was too much coincidence to be a mere accident. Stanley felt like he was holding Destiny's shoes. He ran. Thinking back now, he wasn't sure where he ran. Maybe he was in a hurry to bring the shoes to his father's, or maybe he was trying to run away from his miserable and humiliating day at school. The patrol car pulled alongside him. The policeman asked him why he was running. Then he took the shoes and made a call on his radio. Shortly thereafter, Stanley was arrested. It turned out the sneakers had been stolen from a display at the homeless shelter, that even rich people were going to come into the shelter and pay hundreds of dollars to eat food, and that the poor people ate every day for free. Clyde Livingston, who had once lived at the shelter when he was younger, was going to speak and sign autographs. His shoes would be auctioned and was expected to sell for over $5,000. All the money would go to help the homeless. Because of the baseball schedule, Stanley's trial was delayed for several months. His parents would afford a lawyer. You don't need a lawyer, his mother said. Just tell the truth. Stanley told the truth, but perhaps it would have been better if he lied a little. He could have said he found the shoes on the street. No one believed they fell from the sky. It wasn't destiny, he realized. It was no good rotten pig stealing great-great-grandfather. The judge called Stanley's crime despicable. The shoes are valued over $5,000. It was money that could provide food and shelter for the homeless, and you stole that from them, just so you could have a souvenir. The judge said there was an opening in Camp Green Lake, and he suggested this one camp might improve Stanley's character. It was either that or jail. Stanley's parents asked if they could have some time to find out more about Camp Green Lake, but the judge advised them to make a quick decision. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Chapter 7. A shovel fell heavily instead. He saw fleshy hands. He tried to jam it into the earth, but the blade banged against the ground and bounced off with making a dent. The vibrations ran up the shaft of the shovel into Stanley's wrist, making his bones rattle. It was still dark. The only light came from the moon and the stars, more stars than Stanley had ever seen before. It seemed that only got to sleep when Mr. Podensky came in and woke everyone up. Using all his might, he brought the shovel back down onto the dry lake bed. The force stung in his hands, but made no impression on the earth. He wondered if he had a defective shovel. He glanced at Zero, about 15 feet away, who scooped out a shovel of dirt and dumped it into the pile that was already almost a foot tall. For breakfast, they had been served some kind of lukewarm cereal. The best part was the orange juice. They each got a pint carton. The cereal actually didn't taste too bad, but it smelled just like it's caught. Then they filled their canteens, got to their shovels, and were marched out across the lake. Each group was assigned a different area. The shovels were kept in a shed near the showers. They all looked the same to Stanley, although X-Ray was no special shovel, with no one else that was allowed to use. X-Ray claimed it was shorter than the others, but if it was only by a fraction of an inch. The shovels were 5 feet long from the tip to the steel blade to the end of the wooden shaft. Stanley's hole would have to be as deep as his shovel. He had to be able to lay the shovel flat across the bottom in any direction. That was why X-Ray wanted a shorter shovel. The lake was so full of holes in the mountains that it reminded Stanley of pictures that he'd seen of the moon. If you find anything interesting or unusual, Mr. Podensky had told him, you should report it or either your Mr. Sir and come around here with a water truck. If the warden likes what you found, you'll get the rest of the day off. What are we supposed to be looking for? Stanley asked him. You're not looking for anything. You're digging to build character. It's just as if you find everything the warden would like to know about it. He glanced helplessly at his shovel. It wasn't defective. He was defective. He noticed a thin crack in the ground. He placed his point on the shovel on top of it, then jumped back on the blade of both feet. The shovel sank a few inches into the packed earth. He smiled. For once in his life, it paid to be overweight. He leaned on the shaft and pried his first shovelful of dirt and then dumped it to the side. Only 10 million more to go, he thought, then placed the shovel back into the crack and jumped on it again. He unearthed several shovelfuls of dirt in his manner. Before it occurred to him, he was dumping his dirt within the perimeter of his hole. He laid his shovel flat on the ground, marked where the edge of the hole would be. 5 feet was awfully wide. He moved the dirt already dug up and past his mark. He took a drink from his canteen. 5 feet would be awfully deep, too. The digging got easier after a while. The ground was hard as the surface, where the sun had baked the crust about 8 inches deep. Beneath that, the earth was looser. But by the time Stanley broke past the crust, a blister had formed in the middle of his right thumb, and it hurt to hold the shovel. Stanley's great-great-grandfather was named Elias Yelnats. He was born in Lativa, and he was 50 years old when he fell in love with Myra Mennick. He didn't know he was Stanley's great-great-grandfather. Myra Mennick was 14. He would turn 15 in 2 months, which had time for her father to decide if she would be married. Lila went to her father, asked for her hand, but so did Iger Barkov, the pig farmer. Iger was 57 years old. He had a red nose and fat, puffy cheeks. I'll trade you my fattest pig for your daughter, Iger offered. And what have you got? Myra's father asked Isla. A heart full of love, said Elira. I'd rather have a fat pig, said Myra's father. Desperate, Elira went to see Madame Zeroni, the old Egyptian woman who lived in the edge of town, who had become friends with her. He thought she was quite a bit older than him. He was older than Igor Barkov. The other boys of the village liked to mud wrestle. Elira preferred visiting Madame Zeroni and listened to her many stories. Madame Zeroni had dark skin and a very wide mouth. Then she looked at you, her eyes seemed to expand, and you felt like she was looking right through you. Isla, what's wrong? She asked. Before he could even tell her, he was upset. He was sitting in her homemade wheelchair. He had no left foot. Her leg stopped at her ankle. I'm in love with Myra Menek, Isla confessed, but Igor Barkov has offered to trade his fattest pig for her. I can't compete with that. Good, said Madame Zeroni. You're too young to get married. You have a whole life ahead of you. But I love Myra. Myra's head is as empty as a flower pot, but she's beautiful. So is the flower pot. But she push a plow? Can she milk a goat? No, she is too delicate. Can she have an intelligent conversation? No, she's silly and foolish. She would take care of you when you were sick? No, she's spoiled and will only want you to take care of her. So she is beautiful. So what? Patooey. Madame Zeroni spat in the dirt. She told Elia that she would go to America, like my son. That's where your future lies, not with Myra Menek. But Elia would hear none of that. He was 15, and all he could see is Myra's shallow beauty. Madame Zeroni hated to see Elia so forlorn. Against her better judgment, he agreed to help him. It just so happens my sow gave birth to a litter of piglets yesterday, she said. Here's one little runt from who she won't suckle. You may have him. He won't die anyway. Madame Zeroni led Elira down to the back of her house where he kept her pigs. Elira took the tiny piglet and he didn't see that it was good to do with him. He wasn't much bigger than a rat. He'll grow, Madame Zeroni assured him. Do you see that mountain at the edge of the forest? Yes, said Elia. On top of the mountain there's a stream where the water runs uphill. You must carry the piglet every day to the top of the mountain and let it drink from the stream. As it drinks, you are to sing to him. She taught Elia a special song to sing to the pig. On the day of Myra's 15th birthday, you shall carry the pig up to the mountain for the last time. Then make it directly to Myra's father. It will be fatter than any Igor's pigs. If it is that fat, said Elia, how will be able to carry up the mountain? The piglet is not too heavy for now, is it? Asked Madame Zeroni. Of course not, said Elia. Do you think it'll be too heavy for you tomorrow? No. Every day you'll carry the pig up the mountain. It will get a little bigger, but you'll get a little stronger. After you give the pig to Myra's father, I want you to do one more thing for me. Anything. I want you to carry me up the mountain. I want to drink from the stream, and I want you to sing the song to me. Elia promised he would. Madame Zeroni warned that if he failed to do this, he and his descendants would be doomed for all eternity. At the time, Elia thought nothing of the curse. He was just a 15-year-old kid with eternity, which didn't seem longer than a week or a Tuesday. Besides, he liked Madame Zeroni and would be glad to carry up the mountain. He would have done it right and there, but he wasn't strong enough. Stanley was still digging. His hole was about 3 feet deep, but it was only the center. It slopped upward on the edges. The sun had always come over the horizon, but he always could feel the hot rays against his face. As he reached down to pick up the canteen, he felt a sudden rush of dizziness and put his hands to his knees to steady himself. For a moment he was afraid he would throw up, but the moment passed. He drank his last drop of water from his canteen. He had blisters on every one of his fingers and one in the center of each palm. Everyone else's hole was a lot deeper than his. He couldn't actually see their holes, but could tell by the size of their dirt piles. He saw the cloud of dust moving across the wasteland. As the other boys had stopped digging, and they were watching it too. The dirt cloud moved closer. He could see that the trail behind was a red pickup truck. The truck stopped near where they were digging, and the boys lined up behind it. X-ray in front, Zero at the rear. Stanley got in line behind Zero. Mr. Sir filled each of the canteens with a tank of water in the bed of the pickup. As he took Stanley's canteen from him, he said, "This isn't the Girl Scouts, is it?" Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. Mr. Sir followed Stanley back to his hole to see how he was doing. "You better get with it," he said, "or else you're going to be digging the hottest part of the day." He popped down the sunflower seeds into his mouth, definitely removed the shells with his teeth, and spat them into Stanley's hole. Every day, Elira carried the little piglet up the mountain, and sang it was a drag up the stream. As the pig grew fatter, Elira grew stronger. On the day of Myra's 15th birthday, pig weighed over 50 stones. Madame Zeroni had told him to carry the pig up the mountain on that day as well, but Elira didn't want to present himself to Myra smelling like a pig. Instead, he took a bath. It was the second bath in less than a week. Then he led the pig to Myra's. Igor Borov was there with the pig as well. They were two of the finest pigs I've ever seen, Myra's father declared. He was also impressed with Elira, who seemed to have grown bigger and stronger in the last 2 months. "I used to think you were a good-for-nothing book reader," he said, "but I see now that you're an excellent mud wrestler. May I marry your daughter?" Elira boldly asked. "First, I must weigh your pigs." Alas, poor Elira had carried his pig up the mountain one last time. The two pigs weighed exactly the same. Stanley's blisters had ripped open and new blisters formed. He kept changing the grip of the shovel to try to avoid the pain. Eventually, he removed his cap and held it between his shaft of his shovel and his raw hands. This helped, but digging was harder because the cap would slip and slide. The sun beat down on the unprotected head and neck. Though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he had been aware of for a while that his piles of dirt were close to his hole. The piles were outside his 5-foot circle, and he could see he was going to run out of room. Still, he pretended otherwise to kept adding more dirt to the piles that he would eventually have to move. The problem was that the dirt was in the ground. It was compacted. It expanded when it excavated. The piles were a lot bigger than the hole was deep. And it was either now or later. Reluctantly, he climbed up out of his hole and once again dug his shovel into the pressurely dug dirt. Myra's father got down his hand and knee and closely examined each pig, tail and snout. Those are two of the finest pigs I've ever seen, he said at last. How am I to decide? I only have one daughter. Why not let Myra decide, said Celia. That's preposterous, exclaimed Igor, expelling saliva as he spoke. Myra's just an empty-headed girl, said her father. How can she possibly decide when I, her father, can't? She knows how she feels in her heart, said Elira. Myra's father rubbed his chin. Then he laughed and said, Why not? He slapped Elira on the back. It doesn't matter to me, a pig is a pig. He summoned his daughter. Elira brushed from Myra and entered the room. Good afternoon, Myra, he said. She looked at him. You're Elira, right? He asked. Myra, said her father. Elira or Igor have each offered you a pig in your hand and married. Doesn't matter to me, a pig is a pig. So I'll take that you make the choice. Whom do you wish to marry? Myra looked confused. You want me to decide? That's right, my blossom, he said to her father. Gee, I don't know, said Myra. Which pigs weigh more? They both weigh the same, said her father. Golly, said Myra. I guess I choose Elira. No Igor, nor Elira, nor Igor. Oh, I know. I think of a number between 1 and 10. I'll marry whoever guesses the closest number. Ready? I'm ready. 10, guessed Igor. Elira said nothing. Elira, said Myra. What number do you guess? Elira didn't pick a number. Marry Igor, he muttered. You can keep my pig as a wedding present. The next time the water struck came, it was driven by Mr. Podensky, who also brought sack lunches. Stanley sat his back against the pile of dirt to eat. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. How you doing? Asked Magnet. Not real good, said Stanley. Well, the first hole is the hardest, Magnet said. Stanley took a deep breath, and he couldn't afford dawdle. He was in behind the others, and the sun kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet, but he didn't know if he had the strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what he would do to him, what they do to him. What could they do to him? His clothes were soaked in sweat. His school had learned that sweating was good for you. It was nature's way of keeping you cool. So why is he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. Where are you supposed to be? Go to the bathroom, he asked. Magnet just his arm, a great expanse around him. Pick a hole, any hole, he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over in the dirt pile. Behind him, he heard Magnet say, but first, make sure nothing's living in it. After leaving Myra's house, Elia wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself down by the wharf. He stood on the edge of the pier and stared out into the cold black water. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him, even if she didn't love him. Couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? But it was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathering on the other dock, and he went to see what was going on. The sign read, Deck hands wanted, free passage to America. He had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him aboard. The captain would see that Elira was a man of great strength. Not everybody could carry a full-grown pig up the side of the mountain. It wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading across the Atlantic Ocean he suddenly remembered he had promised to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain. He felt terrible. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought it was a lot of nonsense. He felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted a drink from the stream before she died. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, and she had the first one to finish digging. You're finished, Stanley asked nervously. Zero said nothing. Stanley watched to Zero's hole and watched him measure with a shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and its sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary moved from the dirt. Zero pulled himself up the surface. He hadn't even smiled. He looked down at the perfectly dug hole, spat in it, and then turned and headed back to the camp compound. Zero's one weird dude, said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had long, skinny neck, a big round head with wild, fuzzy blonde hair, and stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down his neck, like it was on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat into his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into the hole and return to the camp compound. Stanley kept digging. His hole was up to his shoulders, although it was hard to tell exactly where the ground level was. Because of his dirt piles completely around the hole, the deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt out of the hole. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was stained with blood from his hands. He felt like he was digging his own grave. In America, Linus learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. He would push a plow, milk a goat, and most important, he'd think of for herself. She and Elia often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Elia worked hard, but bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You remember Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Elia was forever looking for him. He walked up to a complete stranger, asked if they knew someone named Zeroni, and never heard of anyone named Zeroni. One did. Elia wasn't sure if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Then he up the mountain and sing a pig lullaby to him. After his barn was struck by lightning for the third time, he told Sarah his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should leave me and find someone who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Elia. Sarah smiled. "Sing me the pig lullaby." He sang it for her. Her eyes sparkled. "That's so pretty. What does it mean?" Elia tried his best to translate from Latvian to English, but it was the same. "It rhymes in Latvian," he told her. "I could tell," said Sarah. A year later, the child was born. Sarah named Stanley, because he noticed that Stanley was yelled at spelled backwards. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that they rhymed, and every night she sang it to little Stanley. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark of the trees was as soft as the skies, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, trying to the moon. If only. Stanley's hole was as deep as a shovel, and not quite wide enough to on the bottom. He grimaced at a slice of chunk dirt, then raised up and flung into onto a pile. He laid the shovel back down in the bottom of the hole, and to his surprise it fit. He rotated the only chip off a few chunks of dirt, there and there, before he lied flat across the hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching. He felt a strange sense of pride being able to show Mr. Sir and Mr. Pendensky that he dug his first hole. He put his arms on his rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he didn't have any strength. He was strapped to his hole, and it was funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. "Stanley," here Mr. Pendensky called. Using a shovel, he dug 2 footholes in the whole wall. He climbed out to see Mr. Pendensky walking over to him. "I was afraid you fainted," Mr. Pendensky said. "You would have been the first." "I'm finished," Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap on his head. "All right," said Mr. Pendensky, raising a hand for high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't have enough strength. Mr. Pendensky lowered his hand and looked down at Stanley's hole. "Well done," he said. "You want to ride back?" Stanley shook his head. "I'll walk." Mr. Pendensky climbed back into his truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away, then took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up the last bit of saliva and spat. Chapter 8. A lot of people don't believe in curses. A lot of people don't believe in yellow-spotted lizard either. But if one bites you, it doesn't make a difference whether you believe in it or not. Actually, it's kind of odd that scientists named the lizard after its yellow spots. Each lizard has exactly 11 yellow spots, but the spots are hard to see in the yellow-green body. The lizard is from 6 to 10 inches long and has big red eyes. In truth, the eyes are yellow, but it's skin around the eyes which is red. But everyone always speaks of its red eyes. There's also black teeth and milky white tongue. Looking at one, you will have thought that it would have been named something like a red-eyed lizard or a black-toothed lizard or perhaps the white-tongued lizard. If you've ever been close enough to yellow spots, you're probably dead. The yellow-spotted lizard like to live in holes, which offer shade in the sun, protection for predatory birds. Up to 20 lizards may live in one hole. They have strong, powerful legs and can leap out of very deep holes to attack their prey. They eat small animals, insects, certain cactus thorns, and shells of sunflower seeds. Chapter 9. Stanley stood in the shower and let a cold water pour over his hot and sore body. It was 4 minutes of heaven. For the second day in a row, he didn't use soap. He was too tired. There was no roof over the shower building. The walls were raised up 6 inches off the ground except for the corners. There was no drain on the floor. The water ran out under the walls and evaporated quickly in the sun. He put on his clean set of orange clothes. He returned to his tent, put his dirty clothes in his crate, and got out a pen and a box of stationery and headed to the rec room. The sign at the door said rec room. Nearly everything in the room was broken. The TV, the pinball machine, and the furniture. Even the people looked broken, with their worn-out bodies sprawled over the various chairs and sofas. X-Ray and Armpit were playing pool. The surface of the table reminded Stanley of the surface of the lake. It was full of bumps, holes, because many people have carved their initials into the felt. There was a hole in the far wall. An electric fan had been placed in front of it. Cheap air conditioning, at least the fan worked. As Stanley made his way across the room, he tripped over an outstretched leg. "Hey, watch it," said an orange lump on the chair. "You watch it," muttered Stanley, too tired to care. "What'd you say?" the lump demanded. "Nothing," said Stanley. The lump rose. It was almost as big as Stanley, and a lot tougher. "You said something." He poked his fat finger in Stanley's neck. "What'd you say?" A crowd quickly formed around them. "Be cool," said X-Ray. He put his hand on Stanley's shoulder. "You don't want to mess with the caveman, he warned. The caveman's cool, said Armpit. I'm not looking for trouble, Stanley said. I'm just tired, that's all. The lump grunted. X-Ray and Armpit led Stanley over the couch. Squid slid over to make room when Stanley sat down. Did you see the caveman back there? X-Ray asked. The caveman's one tough dude, said Squid, and he lightly punched Stanley's arm. Stanley leaned back against the torn vinyl upholstery. Despite of his shower, his body still radiated heat. He was trying to start anything, he said. The last thing he wanted to do after killing himself all day on the lake was get in a fight with a boy called Caveman. He was glad X-Ray Armpit had come to his rescue. Well, how'd you like your first hole? Asked Squid. Stanley groaned, and the other boys laughed. Well, the first hole's the hardest, said Stanley. No way, said X-Ray. The second hole's a lot harder. You're hurting before you even get started. If you think you're sore now, just wait until how you feel tomorrow morning, right? That's right, said Squid. Plus, the fun's gone, said X-Ray. The fun? Asked Stanley. Don't lie to me, said X-Ray. I bet you always wanted to dig a big hole, right? Am I right? Stanley had never really thought about it before, but he knew better than to tell X-Ray he wasn't right. Every kid in the world wants to dig a great big hole, said X-Ray. To China, right? Right, said Stanley. See what I mean, said X-Ray. That's what I'm saying, but now the fun's gone, and you gotta do it again, and again, and again. Can't fun and games, said Stanley. What's in the box, asked Squid. Stanley forgot he brought it. Paper. I was gonna write a letter to my mother. Your mother? Squid laughed. You'll worry if I don't. Squid scowled. Stanley looked around the room. This was the only place in the camp where the boys could enjoy themselves, and that's what they do. They wrecked it. The glass on the TV was smashed as if someone had put his foot through it. Every table and chair seemed to be missing at least one leg. Everything leaned. He waited to write a letter till Squid had gotten up and joined a game of pool. Dear Mom, today was the first day at camp. I've already made some friends. We've been on the lake all day, so I'm pretty tired. Once I pass the swimming test, I'll get to learn how to water ski. He stopped writing because he became aware that somebody was reading over his shoulder. He turned to see Zero standing behind the couch. Don't want her to worry about me, he explained. Zero said nothing. He just stared at the letter with a serious, almost angry look on his face. Stanley slipped it back into the stationery box. Did the shoes have red X's on the back? Zero asked him. It took Stanley a moment, but he realized Zero was asking about Clyde Livingston's shoes. Yes, they did, he said. He wondered how Zero knew that. Brand X was a popular brand of sneakers. Maybe Clyde Livingston made a commercial for them. Zero stared at him for a moment in the same intensity which he had staring at the letter. Stanley poked his finger through a hole in the vinyl couch and pulled out some stuffing. He wasn't sure of what he was doing. Come on, caveman dinner, said Armpit. You coming, caveman? Said Squid. Stanley looked around to see Armpit and Squid were talking to him. Sure, he said, and he put a piece of stationery back in the box. Then got up and followed the boys out of the tables. The lump wasn't the caveman he was. He shrugged and let his left shoulder, it was better than barf bag. Chapter 10. Stanley had no trouble falling asleep, but morning came much too quickly. Every muscle in the joint of the body ached as he tried to get out of bed. He didn't think it was possible that his body hurt more than he did the day before. It wasn't just his arms and back, it was his legs, ankle, and waist also hurt. The only thing that got him out of the bed was knowing that every second he wasted meant he was 1 second closer to the rising sun. He hated the sun. He could barely lift a spoon during breakfast, and then he was out on the lake, the spoon replaced by a shovel. He found a crack in the ground and began to dig his second hole. He stepped back on the shovel blade and pushed on the very back of the shaft in the base of the thumb. His hurt less, and trying to hold the shaft in the blistered fingers. As he dug, he was careful to dump the dirt far away from his hole. He needed to save the area around the hole for when his hole was much deeper. He didn't know if he'd get that far. X-Ray was right. The second hole was the hardest, and it would take a miracle. As long as the sun wasn't out yet, he removed his cap and used it to protect his hands. Once the sun rose, he would have to put it back on his head. His neck and forehead had been badly burned the day before. He took one shovelful at a time, and tried not to think of the awesome task that lay ahead of him. After an hour or so, his sore muscles seemed to loosen up a bit. He grunted as he tried to stick his shovel into the dirt. His cap slipped out of under his fingers, the shovel fell free. He let it lie there. He took a drink from his canteen and guessed that water truck would be coming soon. But he didn't finish all the water just in case he was wrong. He learned to wait until he saw the truck, before drinking the last drop. The sun wasn't up yet, and his rays arced over the horizon and brought light to the sky. He reached down and picked up his cap, where next to it was a wide, flat rock. As he put his cap on his head, he continued to look down at the rock. He picked it up and thought he could see a shape of a fish, fossil eyes in it. He rubbed off some dirt, and the outline of the fish became clear. The sun peeked over the horizon, and he got to see tiny lines where every one of the fish bones had been. He looked at the barren land all around him. True, everyone referred to the area as a lake, but still hardly ever believed that this dry land was once full of water. Then he remembered what Mr. Sir and Mr. Podensky had both said. If he dug up anything interesting, he would report it to them. If the warden liked it, he would get the rest of the day off. He looked back down at the fish. He found his miracle. He continued to dig, though very slowly, and he waited for the water truck. He didn't want to bring attention to his find, afraid of one of the other boys might try to take it from him. He tossed the rock face down beside the dirt pile, as if it had no special value. A short while later, he saw a cloud of dirt heading across the lake. Truck stopped and the boys lined up. It was always lined in the same order. Stanley realized no matter who got there first, X-Ray was always in front of the line. Then came Armpit, Squid, Zigzag, Magnet, and Zero. Stanley got in line behind Zero. He was glad to be at the back, so no one would notice the fossil. His pants had very large pockets, but the rock was still made a bulge. Mr. Podensky filled each boy's canteen so Stanley was the only one left. I found something, Stanley said, taking it out of his pocket. Mr. Podensky reached for Stanley's canteen, but Stanley handed him the rock instead. What's this? It's a fossil, said Stanley. See, a fish. Mr. Podensky looked at it again. See, you can even eat all the little bones, said Stanley. Interesting, miss, said Mr. Podensky. Let me have your canteen. Stanley handed it to him. Mr. Podensky filled it and then returned it. So, will I get the rest of the day off? What for? You know, you said if I found something interesting, the warden would give me the day off. Mr. Podensky lastly gave the fossil back to Stanley. Sorry, Stanley, but the warden isn't interested in fossil. Let me see that, said Magnet, taking the rock from Stanley. Stanley continued to stare at Mr. Podensky. Hey, Zig, dig this rock. Cool, said Zigzag. Stanley saw his fossil being passed around. I didn't see nothing, said X-Ray. He took off his glasses, wiped his dirty clothes and put them back on. See? Look at the little fishy, said Armpit. Stanley returned to his hole. It wasn't fair. Mr. Podensky had even said his fossil was interesting. He slammed his shovel into the ground and pried up another piece of earth. After a while, he noticed X-Ray had come by and was watching him dig. Hey, caveman, let me talk to you a second, X-Ray said. Stanley put down his shovel and stepped out of his hole. Hey, say, listen, said X-Ray. If you find something else, give it to me, okay? Stanley wasn't sure what to say. X-Ray was clearly the leader of the group, and Stanley didn't want to get on his bad side. You're new here, right? Said X-Ray. I've been here for almost a year. I've never found anything. You know, my eyesight's not that so good. No one knows this, but you know why my name's X-Ray? Stanley shrugged one shoulder. The Pig Latin for Rex. That's all. I'm too blind to find anything. Stanley tried to remember how Pig Latin worked. I mean, X-Ray went on. Why should you get a day off when you only been here a couple of days? If any gets the day off, it should be me. That's only fair, right? I guess, Stanley agreed. X-Ray smiled. You're a good guy, caveman. Stanley picked up his shovel. The more he thought about it, the more he was glad that he agreed to let X-Ray have anything he might find. If he was going to survive Camp Green Lake, it was more important that X-Ray think he was a good guy than it was for him to get one day off. Besides, he didn't expect to find anything anyway. There probably wasn't anything of interest out here. And if there was, he'd never been what you would call lucky. He slammed his blade into the ground, then dumped out another shovel full of dirt. It was a little surprising, he thought, that X-Ray was the leader of the group since he obviously wasn't the biggest or toughest. In fact, except for Zero, X-Ray was the smallest. His Armpit was the biggest. Zigzag may have been taller than Armpit, but it was only because of his neck. Yes, Armpit and all the others seemed to be willing to do whatever X-Ray asked of them. As Stanley dug up another shovel full of dirt, it occurred to him that Armpit wasn't the biggest. He, the caveman, was bigger. It was glad they called him Caveman. It meant they accepted him as a member of the group. It would have been glad if they called him Barfbag. It was quite remarkable of him. At school, bullies like Derek Doone would used to pick on him. Yet Derek Doone would be the scariest, senseless any of the boys there. As he dug his hole, Stanley thought he would be like Derek Doone and had to fight Armpit or Squid. Derek wouldn't stand a chance. He imagined that it would be like he became good friends with them all, and then for some reason they all went with him to school, and then Derek Doone tried to steal his notebook. Just what do you think you're doing? Asked Squid as he slams his head into Derek Doone's smug face. Caveman's our friend, says Armpit, grabbing him by the shirt collar. Stanley played the scene over and over in his mind, and each time watching another boy from the Group D beat up Derek Doone, it helped him dig his hole with ease and his own suffering. Whatever pain he felt was being felt 10 times worse by Derek. Chapter 12. Again, Stanley was the last one finished digging. It was late afternoon and he dragged himself back to the compound. This time he would have accepted a ride on the truck if it was offered. When he got to his tent, he found Mr. Podensky and the other boys sitting in the circle on the ground. Welcome, Stanley, said Mr. Podensky. Hey, caveman, did you get your dough dug? As Magnet, he managed to nod. You spit in it? Asked Squid. He nodded again. You're right, he said to X-Ray. The second hole was the hardest. X-Ray shook his head. The third hole is the hardest, he said. Come join our circle, said Mr. Podensky. Stanley plopped down between Squid and Magnet. He needed a rest before taking a shower. We've been discussing what we want to do with our lives, said Mr. Podensky. We're not going to be at Camp Green Lake forever. We need to prepare for the day we leave here and join the rest of society. That's a great Hey, that's great, Mom, said Magnet. They're going to finally let you out of here? The other boys laughed. Okay, Jose, said Mr. Budensky. What do you want to do with your life? I don't know, said Magnet. You need to think about it, said Mr. Budensky. It's important to have goals, otherwise you're going to end up right back in jail. What do you like to do? I don't know, said Magnet. You must like something, said Mr. Budensky. I like animals, said Magnet. Good, said Mr. Budensky. Does anyone know of the jobs that involve animals? Veterinarian, said Armpit. That's right, said Mr. Budensky. He can work in a zoo, said Zigzag. He belongs in a zoo, said Squid. And then he and X-Ray laughed. How about you, Stanley? Any ideas for Jose? Stanley sighed. Animal trainer, he said. Like for the circus or movies or something like that. Any of those jobs sound good to you, Jose? Asked Mr. Budensky. Yeah, I like what Caveman said about training animals for movies. I think it would be fun to train monkeys. X-Ray laughed. Don't laugh, Rex, said Mr. Budensky. We don't laugh at people's dreams. Someone's going to have to train monkeys for the movies. Who are you kidding, Mom? Said X-Ray. Magnet's not going to be a monkey trainer. You don't know that, said Mr. Budensky. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Nothing in life is easy, but no reason to give up. You're surprised what you can accomplish if you set your mind to it. After all, you only have one life, so you should try to make the most of it. Stanley tried to figure out what he'd say to Mr. Budensky asked him, and he wanted to do with his life. He used to think he wanted to work for the FBI, but this doesn't seem the appropriate place to mention that. So far, you've all done a pretty good job busting up your lives, said Mr. Budensky. You know, you think you're cool. He looked at Stanley. So, you're a caveman now, huh? You like digging holes, caveman? Stanley didn't know what to say. Well, let me tell you something, caveman. You're on the count of one person. If it wasn't for that person, you wouldn't be digging holes in the hot sun. You know who that person is? My note. Good, dirty, rotten pigsty and great-great-grandfather? The other boys howled with laughter. Even Zero smiled. It was the first time Stanley had ever seen Zero smile. He usually had such an angry expression on his face. Now, he had such a huge smile, seemed too big for his face, like a smile on a jack-o'-lantern. No, said Mr. Budensky. That person is you, Stanley. You're the reason you're here. You're responsible for yourself. You messed up your life, and it's so to you to fix it. No one else is going to do it for you, for any of you. Mr. Budensky looked from one boy to another. You're all special in your own way, he said. You've all got something to offer. You have to think about it when you want to do. Then do it. Even you, Zero. You're not completely worthless. The smile was now gone from Zero's face. What do you want to do with your life, Mr. Budensky asked him. Zero's mouth was shut tight. He glared at Mr. Budensky. His dark eyes seemed to expand. What about it, Zero? Asked Mr. Budensky. What do you like to do? I like to dig holes. Chapter 13. All too soon, Stanley was back on the lake, sticking a shovel into the dirt. X-Ray was right. The third hole was the hardest. So was the fourth hole, and the fifth hole, and the sixth, He dug a shovel into the dirt. After a while, he lost track of the day of the week, and how many holes he had dug. It all seemed like one big hole, and it would take a year and a half to dig it. Guess he'd lost at least 5 pounds. He figured that in a year and a half he'd be better in great physical condition, or else dead. He dug a shovel into the dirt. It wouldn't always be this hot, he thought. Surely it would be cool in December. Maybe then they throws. He dug his shovel into the dirt. His skin had gotten tougher. It didn't hurt so much to hold the shovel. As he drank from the canteen, he looked up to the sky. A cloud had appeared early in the day. It was the first cloud he could remember seeing since coming to Camp Green Lake. He and the other boys had been watching it all day, hoping it would move in front of the sun. Occasionally it got close, but it was just teasing them. This hole was waist deep. He dug his shovel into the dirt. As he dumped it out, as he thought he would saw something glistening and fell into the dirt pile. Whatever it was quickly buried. Stanley started a pile a moment, unsure if he'd even seen it. Even if it was something, what good would it do to him? He promised to give everything he found to X-Ray. It didn't seem like the worth the effort to climb out of this hole and check it out. He glanced up at the cloud, which was close enough to the sun that he squinted to look at it. He dug his shovel back into the earth, scooped out some dirt, and lifted it over a dirt pile. But instead of dumping it there, he tossed it off to the side. His curiosity got to the better of him. He climbed out of the hole and sifted his fingers through the pile. He found something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a gold tube, about as long as the wide of the second finger on his right hand. The tube was open at one end and closed on the other. Just a few drops of precious water to clean it. There seemed to be some kind of design on the flat, closed end. He poured a few drops of water on it and rubbed it on the side of the pants pocket. He looked again at the design engraved on the flat bottom of the tube. He could see the outline of a heart, which were letters KB etched inside it. He tried to figure out some way he wouldn't have to give it to X-Ray. He would just keep it, but that wouldn't do him any good. He wanted the day off. He looked at the large piles of dirt near X-Ray as was digging. X-Ray was probably the most finished for the day. Getting the rest of the day off would hardly do him much good. X-Ray would first have to show the tube to Mr. Sir and Mr. Budensky, who would then have to show it to the warden. By then, X-Ray would be done anyway. Stanley wondered about being to secretly take the tube directly to the warden. He could explain the situation to the warden, and the warden might give an excuse for giving the day off, so X-Ray wouldn't suspect. He looked across the lake toward the cabin under the 2 oak trees. The place scared him. He'd been at the Camp Green Lake almost 2 weeks, and he almost didn't see the warden. That was just as well. If he could go to his entire year and a half without seeing the warden, it would be fine with him. Besides, he didn't know if the warden would find the tube interesting. He looked at it again. It looked familiar. He thought he'd seen something like it somewhere before, but couldn't quite place it. "What do you got there, caveman?" asked Zigzag. Stanley's large hand closed around the tube. "Nothing, just, it was useless. I think I might have found something." "Another fossil?" "No, I'm not sure what it is." "Let me see," said Zigzag. Instead of showing it to Zigzag, Zigzag brought it to X-Ray. Zigzag followed. X-Ray looked at the tube, then rubbed his dirty glasses on his tight, dirty shirt, and looked at the tube again. One by one, the other boys dropped their shovel and came to look. "It looks like an old shotgun shell," said Squid. "Yeah, that's probably what it is," said Stanley. He decided not to mention it, engraved design. Maybe nobody would notice it. He thought X-Ray could see it. "No, it's too long a thing to be a shotgun shell," said Magnet. "It's probably just a piece of junk," said Stanley. "Well, I'll show it to Mom," said X-Ray. "See what he thinks. Who knows? Maybe I'll get the day off." "Your hole's almost finished," said Stanley. "Yes, so?" Stanley raised and lowered his shoulder. Why don't you wait until tomorrow to show it to Mom?" he suggested. "You can pretend you found it first thing in the morning. Then you could get the whole day off instead of just an hour, or so this afternoon." X-Ray smiled. "Good thinking, caveman." He dropped the tube into his large pocket and right leg of the dirty orange pants. Stanley returned to his hole. When the water truck came, Stanley stared at his place in the end of the line, but X-Ray told him to get behind Magnet in front of Zero. Stanley moved up one place in line. Chapter 14. That night, as Stanley lay in a scratchy and smelly cot, he tried to figure out what he would have done differently, but there was nothing he could do. For once in his lucky life, he was in the right place in the right time. It still didn't help him. "You got it?" he asked X-Ray the next morning at his breakfast. So X-Ray looked at him with half-open eyes behind his dirty atlas. "I don't know what you're talking about," he grumbled. "You know," said Stanley. "No, I don't know," X-Ray snapped, "so just leave me alone, okay? I don't want to talk to you." Stanley didn't say another word. Mr. Sir marched the boys out of the lake, chewing some sunflower seeds along the way, spitting out shells. He scraped the ground with a boot heel. He marked where each boy was supposed to dig. Stanley stamped down on the back of the blade of the shovel, piercing the hard, dry earth. He couldn't figure out why X-Ray snapped at him. If he wasn't going to produce the tube, why didn't he make Stanley give it to him? Was he just going to keep it? The tube was gold in color, but Stanley didn't think it was real gold. The water truck came a little after sunrise. Stanley finished the last drop of water and stepped out of his hole. At the time of the day, Stanley sometimes could see some distant hills or mountain on the other side of the lake. They were only visible for a short while and would soon disappear behind the gaze of the heat and dirt. The truck stopped, and the dust of gold drifted past it. X-Ray took his place at the front of the line. Mr. Budensky filled his canteen. "Thanks, Mom," X-Ray said. He didn't mention the tube. Mr. Budensky filled all the canteens, then climbed back into the cab of their pickup. He still had to bring her water to Group E. Stanley could see him getting around 200 yards away. "Mr. Budensky!" X-Ray shouted from his hole. "Wait, Mr. Budensky, I think I might have found something." All the boys followed Mr. Budensky as he walked over to X-Ray's hole. Stanley could see the gold tube sticking out of some dirt on the end of X-Ray's shovel. Mr. Budensky examined it and took a long flat button. "I think the warden is going to like this." "Does X-Ray get a day off?" asked Squid. "Just keep digging until someone says otherwise," Mr. Budensky said. Then he smiled. "But if I were you, Rex, I wouldn't dig too hard." Stanley watched the cloud and dust move across the lake to the cabin beneath the trees. The boys in Group E were just going to have to wait. It didn't take long for the pickup to return. Mr. Budensky stepped out of the cab. A tall woman with red hair stepped out of the passenger side. He looked even taller than she was, since Stanley was down in his hole. She wore the black cowboy hat and black cowboy boots were studded with turquoise stones. The sleeves on her shirt were rolled up and her arms were covered in freckles, as was her face. She walked right up to X-Ray. "This is where you found it?" "Yes, ma'am. Your good work will be rewarded." She turned to Mr. Budensky. "Drive X-Ray back to camp. Let him take a double shower and give him some clean clothes. But first, I want you to fill everyone's canteen." "I just filled them a little while ago," asked Mr. Budensky. The warden stared hard at him. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was soft. "I just filled them. Then, Rex..." "Excuse me," the warden said again. "Did I ask you when you last filled them?" "No, but I just..." "Excuse me." Mr. Budensky stopped talking. The warden wiggled her finger at him to come over. "It's hot and only been getting hotter," she said. "That's fine, boys have been working hard. Don't you think it might be possible that they can take a drink once you filled their last canteens?" Mr. Budensky said nothing. The warden turned to Stanley. "Caveman, will you come here, please?" Stanley was surprised how she knew his name. He had never seen her until she stepped out of the truck. He didn't even know the warden was a woman. He nervously went toward her. Mr. Budensky and I have been having a discussion. Have you taken a drink since Mr. Budensky had filled your canteen? Stanley did not want to cause any trouble for Mr. Budensky. I've got plenty left, she said. Excuse me? He stopped. Yeah, I drank some. Thank you. May I please see your canteen? Stanley handed it to her. Her fingernails were painted dark red. He gently stroked the canteen, letting the water swish in the side of the plastic container. Do you hear the empty spaces? She asked. Yes, said Mr. Budensky. Then fill it, she said. The next time I tell you to something, I expect you to do it without questioning my authority. It's soon much trouble to fill a canteen. I'll give you a shovel. You can dig the hole and the caveman can fill your canteen. She turned back to Stanley. I don't think that would be too much trouble for you, would it? No, said Stanley. So what would it be? She asked Mr. Budensky. Do you want to fill canteens or do you want to dig? I'll fill the canteen, said Mr. Budensky. Thank you. Chapter 15. Mr. Budensky filled the canteens. The warden got a pitchfork out of the back of a pickup. She poked it through X-Ray's dirt pile to see if there's anything else that might have been buried there as well. After you drop off X-Ray, I want you to bring back 3 wheelbarrows, she said. X-Ray got in a pickup. As the truck pulled away, he leaned out the wide window and waved. Zero, said the warden. I want you to take over X-Ray's hole. But seemed now that Zero was the fastest digger. Armpit and Squid, you will keep digging where you have been, she said, but you're each going to have a helper. Zigzag, you help Armpit. Magnet, you help Squid. And Caveman, you work with Zero. When you're done digging the dirt twice, Zero will dig it out of the hole, and Caveman will carefully shovel it into a wheelbarrow. Zigzag will do the same for Armpit and the same for the Magnet and Squid. You don't want to miss anything. If either of you find something, you'll both get the rest of the day off and a double shower. When the wheelbarrows are full, are you to dump them away from this area? We don't want any dirt piles to get in the way. The warden remained out of sight for the remainder of the day, along with Mr. Budensky and Mr. Sir, who showed up after a while. Occasionally, Mr. Sir would leave to take the water to the other groups of campers, but otherwise, he and the water truck stayed parked here. The warden saw it fit that nobody in Group D was ever thirsty. Stanley did as he was told. He carefully looked through all the dirt and dug up by Zero and shoveled it into the wheelbarrow. Though he knew he wouldn't find anything, it's easier than digging his own hole. Then wheelbarrow was full. He took it at a great distance away before dumping it. The warden wouldn't keep still. She kept walking around over the boys' shoulders and sticking their pitchfork through the dirt piles. You're doing fine, just fine, she told Stanley. After a while, he told the boys to switch places so that Stanley, Zigzag, and Magnet dug the holes, and Zero, Armpit, and Squid shoveled the excavated dirt into the wheelbarrows. After lunch, Zero took over the digging again, and Stanley returned to the wheelbarrow. There's no hurry, the warden said several times. The main thing is not to miss anything. The boys still dug each hole until it was well over 6 feet deep and wide. Still, it was easier for 2 boys to dig 6-foot hole than it was for 1 boy to dig a 5-foot hole. All right, that's enough for today, said the warden. I've waited this long, I can't wait another day. Mr. Sir drove her back to the cabin. I wonder how she knew all our names, Stanley said as he walked up to the compound. She watches us all the time, said Zigzag. She's gotten hidden microphones and camera all over the place. But in the tents, the rec room, the shower. The shower, asked Stanley. He wondered if Zigzag was just being paranoid. The cameras are tiny, said Armpit. No bigger than a toenail on your little toe. Stanley was in doubt about that. He didn't think they would make cameras that small. Microphones, maybe. He realized this is why X-Ray didn't want to talk to him about the gold tube at breakfast. X-Ray was afraid of the warden might be listening. One of them was certain. They weren't going to be just digging to build character. They were definitely looking for something. Whatever they were looking for, they were looking in the wrong place. Stanley gazed across the lake, toward the spot where he was digging yesterday and found the gold tube. He dug the hole into his memory. Chapter 16. As Stanley entered the rec room, he could hear X-Ray's voice from all the way across the room. See what I'm saying? X-Ray said, am I right or am I right? The other bodies in the room were a little more than bags of flesh and bones, dumped across the broken chairs and couches. X-Ray was full of life, laughing and waving his arms out as he talked. Yo, caveman, my man, he called out. Stanley made his way across the room. Hey, slide on over, Squid, said X-Ray. Make room for the caveman. Stanley crashed on the couch, then looked at the hidden camera in the shower. He hadn't said anything and hoped the warden hadn't either. What's the matter? Asked X-Ray. You guys tired or something? He laughed. Hey, keep it down, will you? Groaned Zigzag. I'm trying to watch TV. Stanley glanced uncertainly at Zigzag, who was staring intently at a busted television screen. The warden greeted the boys at breakfast the next morning and went with them to the holes. 4 dug in the holes and 3 tended to the wheelbarrows. Glad you're here, X-Ray, she said to him. But we need your sharp eyes. Stanley spent more time pushing the wheelbarrow than digging. Because he was such a slow digger, he carted away the excess dirt and dumped it into the previously dug holes. He was careful not to dump any of it in the hole where the gold tube was actually found. He could still see the tube in his mind. It seemed so familiar, but he couldn't find a place in it. He thought might have been a lid to a fancy gold pen. KB would have been the initials of a famous author. The only famous authors he could think were the Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. Besides, it wasn't really like the top of a pen. By lunchtime, the warden had begun to lose her patience. They made them eat quickly so they could get back to work. If you can't get them to work any faster, she told Mr. Sir, then you're going to have to climb down there and dig with them. After that, everyone worked faster, especially when Mr. Sir was watching them. Stanley practically ran for when he pushed the wheelbarrow. Mr. Sir reminded him that they weren't the Girl Scouts. They didn't quit digging until every other group had finished. Later, as Stanley sat sprawled across the understuffed chair, he tried to think of a way to tell the warden where the tube was really found, without getting himself or X-ray into trouble. It didn't seem possible. He even thought about sneaking out at night and digging in that hole by himself. But the last thing he wanted to do after digging all day was to dig at night, too. Besides, the shovel were locked up at night, and presumably they couldn't be used as weapons. Mr. Brudensky entered the rec room. Stanley called as he made his way to him. "His name's Caveman," said X-Ray. "Stanley," said Mr. Brudensky. "My name's Caveman," said Stanley. "Well, I have a letter for someone named Stanley Yelnats," said Mr. Brudensky. He turned over the envelope in his hand. "It doesn't say Caveman anywhere." Thanks," Stanley said, taking it. "It's from his mother." "Who's it from?" Squid asked. "Your mother?" Stanley put it in his big pocket in his pants. "Are you just going to read it to us?" asked Armpit. "Give him some space," said X-Ray. "If Caveman doesn't want to read it to us, he doesn't have to. It's probably from his girlfriend." Stanley smiled. He read it later, after the other boys had gone to dinner. "Dear Stanley, it was wonderful to hear from you. Your letter made me feel like one of the other moms who can't afford to spend their kids at summer camp. I know it's not the same, but I am very proud of you for trying to make it the best of the bad situation. Who knows, maybe something good will come out of this. Your father thinks this is real close to a breakthrough on his sneaker project. I hope so. The landlord's threatening to evict us because of the odor. I feel sorry for the little old lady who lived in the shoe. It must have smelled awful. Love from both of us." "What's so funny?" Zero asked. It startled him. He thought Zero had gone to dinner with the others. "Nothing, just something my mom wrote." "What'd she say?" Zero asked. "Nothing." "Oh, sorry," said Zero. "Well, see, my dad's trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers, so the apartment kind of smells bad, because he's always cooking these old sneakers. So anyways, in the letter my mom wrote, he felt sorry for a little old lady who lived in the shoe, because it must have smelled bad in there." Zero spoke blankly at him. "You know, the nursery rhyme?" Zero said nothing. "You heard the nursery rhyme with the little old lady who lived in a shoe?" "No." Stanley was amazed. "How's it go?" asked Zero. "Didn't you ever watch Sesame Street?" Stanley asked. Zero blinked blankly, of course. Stanley headed on to dinner. He could have felt pretty silly reciting nursery rhymes at Camp Green Lake. Chapter 17. For the next week and a half, the boys continued digging around the area where X-Ray supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole as well as the holes Armpit and Squid had been digging until the fourth day, when all three holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden came less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. "This is no bigger than it was when I left you yesterday," she said after arriving late one morning. "Well, after sunrise." "What have you been doing down here?" "Nothing," said Squid. It was the wrong thing to say. At just that moment, Armpit was returning from a bathroom break. How nice of you to join us," she said. "And what have you been doing?" "I had to, go." The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backward into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in the front of his shirt, and 3 tiny spots of blood. "You're giving these boys too much water," the warden told Mr. Brudensky. She continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the other groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole, along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he was passed out or not. He looked up at Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. "I ain't dragging that dirt up," Zigzag said. "That's your dirt." "Hey, Mom," Magnet said. "Caveman's been hurt." Stanley threw out his fingers to the side of his neck. He felt his wet blood and pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out of the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of pieces of sack and sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. This is the nap time. When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. "That's your dirt," Zigzag said. "You have to dig it up. It's covering up my dirt." Stanley felt a little dizzy. You could see a small pile of dirt, which the moment realized it was dirt which had been shoveled he was hit. He scooped it up and Zigzag dug his shovel into the ground underneath, where Stanley's dirt had been. Chapter 18. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew how much he had to dig for the day. It was the relief not to have the other shovel swinging past his face, or the warden hanging around. He dug his shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to dump it into a pile, and then made us turn smooth and slow. As he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where the zigzag shovel had hit him. Part of his head, between his neck and ear, was considerably swollen. There was no mirrors in camp, but he imagined that he looked like he had a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened and his hands were tough, callous. He was still the slowest dig, but not much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat into his hole. After his shower, he put dirty clothes in his crate and got out of his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write a letter so Squid and the other boys could make fun of him for writing to his mother. Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses and have to swim a long distance to the lake. Tomorrow we learn. He stopped writing to Zero as Zero walked in the tent and then returned to his letter. He didn't care about Zero thought. Zero was nobody. To rock climb, and that sounds eerie, but don't worry. Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned and felt his neck throb. I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay? Zero said nothing. I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds some character. The other boys, I don't know how, said Zero. What? Can you teach me? Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Teach you what? To rock climb? Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. What? Said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. I want to learn to read and write, said Zero. Stanley let a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero, he was just surprised. All that because he thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. Sorry, he said. I don't know how to teach. After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to try to teach Zero to read and write. He needed to save his energy for people who counted. You don't have to teach me to write, said Zero, just to read. I don't have anybody to write to. Sorry, Stanley said again. His muscles and hands were only parts of his body that toughened over the last several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished his letter. He barely had enough moisture in his mouth to seal the stamp into the envelope. It seemed that no matter how much water he drank, he was always thirsty. Chapter 19. He was awakened one night by a strange noise. At first he thought it might have been some kind of animal, and it frightened him. But as sleep cleared his head, he realized that the noise was coming from the cot next to him. Squid was crying. You okay? Stanley whispered. Squid's head jerked around. He sniffed and caught his breath. Yeah, I'm fine, he whispered, and sniffed again. In the morning, Stanley asked Squid if he was feeling better. What are you, my mother? Asked Squid. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. I got allergies, okay? Squid said. Okay, said Stanley. You open your mouth again and I'll break your jaw. Stanley kept his mouth shut most of the time. He didn't talk too much to any of the boys, afraid he might say the wrong thing. They called him caveman and all that, but he wouldn't forget that they were dangerous too. They were all here for a reason. As Mr. Sir would say, it wasn't Girl Scout camp. Stanley was thankful that there was no racial problems. X-Ray, Armpit, and Zero were black. He, Squid, and Zigzag were white. Magnet was Hispanic. On the lake, they were all the same reddish-brown color, the color of dirt. He looked up from his hole to see the water truck and a trail dust cloud. His canteen was almost half-quarter full. He quickly drank it down and then took his place in line behind Magnet in front of Zero. The air was thick with heat, dust, and exhaust fumes. Mr. Sir filled their canteens. The truck pulled away. Stanley was back in his hole, shovel in hand, when he heard Magnet call out, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" Magnet was standing at ground level, holding a sack of seeds. He popped a handful into his mouth, chewed and swallowed, shells and all. "Over here," called X-Ray. The sack looked about half full. Magnet rolled up at the top, then tossed it to X-Ray. "How about you get them without Mr. Sir seeing you?" asked Armpit. "I can't help it," Magnet said. He had both his hands up, wiggled his fingers, and laughed. "My fingers are like little magnets." The sack from X-Ray to Armpit to Squid. "Sure to eat something that doesn't come from a can," said Armpit. Squid tossed the sack to Zigzag. Stanley knew it would come to him next. He didn't even want it. From the moment Magnet shouted, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" he knew that there would be trouble. Mr. Sir was sure to come back, and anyway, he salted shells would make him thirsty. "Coming your way, caveman," said Zigzag. "Airmail and special delivery." It's unclear whether the seeds spilled before they got to Stanley or after he dropped the bag. It seemed to him that Zigzag hadn't rolled up the top before throwing it, and that was the reason he didn't catch it. But it all happened very fast. One moment the sack was flying through the air, the next thing Stanley knew, the sack was in his hole, his seeds were spilled across the dirt. "Oh man," said Magnet. "Sorry," Stanley said as he tried to sweep the seeds back into the sack. "I don't want to eat dirt," said X-Ray. Stanley didn't know what to do. "The truck's coming," shouted Zigzag. Stanley looked up at the approaching dust cloud, then back down at the spilled seeds. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. What else is new? He dug his shovel into the hole and tried to turn over the dirt and bury the seeds. What should he have done, he realized later, was knock one of his dirt piles back into his hole. But the idea of putting dirt into the hole was unthinkable. "Hello, Mr. Sir," said X-Ray. "Back so soon?" "It seemed like you were just here," said Armpit. "Time flies when you're having fun," said Magnet. Stanley continued to turn the dirt over in his hole. "You Girl Scouts having a good time?" asked Mr. Sir. He was moved from one hole to another. He kicked the dirt pile by Magnet's hole and he moved towards Stanley. Stanley could see 2 seeds at the bottom of his hole. As he tried to cover them up, he unearthed the corner of the sack. "Well, what do you know, caveman?" said Mr. Sir, standing over him. "Looks like you found something." Stanley didn't know what to do. "Dig it out," said Mr. Sir. "We'll take it to the warden. Maybe she'll give you the rest of the day off." "It's not anything," Stanley muttered. "Let me be the judge of that," said Mr. Sir. Stanley reached down and pulled up the anti-burlap sack. He tried to hand it to Mr. Sir, but he wouldn't take it. "So tell me, caveman," said Mr. Sir, "how did my sack of sunflower seeds get in your hole?" "I stole it from your truck." "You did?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." "What happened to all the sunflower seeds?" "I ate them." "By yourself?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." "Hey, caveman," shouted Armpit, "how come you didn't share any with us?" "That's cold, man," said X-Ray. "I thought you were our friend," said Magnet. Mr. Sir looked around from one board to another, then back to Stanley. "Well, see what the warden has to say about this. Let's go." Stanley climbed out of the hole and followed Mr. Sir to the truck. He found the empty sack. It felt good to sit inside the truck without the direct rays of sun. Stanley was surprised how he could feel good without anything at the moment, but he did. It felt good to sit down in a comfortable seat for a change, and as the truck bounced along the dirt, he was able to appreciate the air blowing through the open window into his hot, sweaty face. Chapter 20. It felt good to walk in the shade of 2 oak trees. Stanley wondered as how the condemned man felt on his way to a lecture chair, pretending all the good things in his life for the last time. They had to step around the holes to get the cabin door. Stanley was surprised to see so many around the cabin. He would have expected the warden to not want campers digging close to their home, but several holes were right up against the cabin wall. The holes were closer together here as well, and there were different shapes and sizes. Mr. Sir knocked on the door. Stanley still held the empty sacks. "Yes," warden said, opening the door. "There's been a little trouble out in the lake," Mr. Sir said. "Caveman will tell you all about it." The warden stared at Mr. Sir at a moment, then her gaze turned to Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. Come in, I suppose," said the warden. "You're letting the cold out." It was air-conditioned inside the cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and turned it off. She sat down on the canvas chair and was barefoot, wearing shorts. Her legs were as freckled as her face and arms. "So what is you have to tell me?" Stanley took a breath to steady himself. "While Mr. Sir was filling the canteens, I snuck into the truck and stole a sack of sunflower seeds." "I see." She turned to Mr. Sir. "That's why you brought him here?" "Yes, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack, and Caveman was covering up for X-Ray or somebody. It was a 20-pound sack, and he claims to have eaten it all by himself." He took the sack from Stanley and handed it to the warden. "I see," the warden said again. "The sack wasn't full," said Stanley, "and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole. In that room, Caveman, there's a small flowered case. Will you get it for me, please?" She pointed to the door. Stanley looked at the door, then the warden, then back to the door. He slowly walked toward it. It was some kind of dressing room with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink, we saw a case, white with pink roses. He brought it back out to the warden and set it on the glass coffee table in front of her. She unclasped the latch and opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had one similar to it. She saw several bottles of nail polish remover, and a couple of lipstick tubes, and the other jars were powders. The warden held up a small jar of dark red nail polish. "You see this, caveman?" He nodded. "This is my special nail polish. Do you see any dark, rich color? You can't buy that in a store. You have to make it by myself." But Stanley had no idea what she was going to show him. He was wondering why a warden would ever need to wear nail polish or makeup. "Do you want to know my secret ingredients?" He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. "Rattlesnake venom." With a small paintbrush, she began applying it to her nails on her left hand. "It's perfectly harmless when it's dry." She finished her left hand. She waved it in the air for a few seconds and then began painting the nails on her right hand. "It's only toxic while it's wet." She finished painting her nails, then stood up. She reached over and touched Stanley's face with her fingers. She ran her sharp, wet nails very gently down his neck. He felt his skin tingle. The nail of her pinky was barely touched by the wound behind his ear. The sharp sting of pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned his face to Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. "So, you think we stole your sunflower seeds?" "No, he says he stole them, but I think it was." She stepped toward him and struck him across the face. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanting across the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if the redness was caused by her nail polish or his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir screamed and clutched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling off a hearth onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. "I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds," Mr. Sir moaned. "But if you must know," said the warden, "I liked it better when you smoked." For a second, Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths. Then his head jerked violently, and he let out a shrill scream, worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. "I suggest you go back to your hole now." Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles on his face jump and twitch. His body writhed in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over. "Is he? Excuse me?" said the warden. Stanley was so frightened to speak. "He's not going to die," said the warden. "Unfortunately for you." Chapter 21. It was a long walk back to his hole. Stanley looked out through the haze of the heat and dirt and the other boys, lowering and raising their shovels. Group D was the farthest away, and he realized once again he would be digging long after everyone else had quit. He hoped he finished before Mr. Sir recovered. He didn't want to be out there alone with Mr. Sir. He won't die, the warden said, unfortunately for you. Walking across the desolate wasteland, Stanley thought it was his great-grandfather, not the pig stealer, but the pig stealer's son, the one who was robbed by kissing Kate Barlow. He tried to imagine how he must have felt if the kissing Kate had left him stranded in the desert. He probably wasn't a whole lot different from the way he himself felt now. Kate Barlow had a great-grandfather to the face of the hot, barren desert. The warden had left Stanley to face Mr. Sir. Somehow, this great-grandfather had survived the 17 days before he rescued by a couple of rattlesnake hunters. He was insane when they found him. When he was asked how long he lived, he said he found refuge on God's thumb. He spent nearly a month in the hospital. He ended up marrying one of the nurses. Nobody ever knew what he meant by God's thumb, including himself. Stanley heard the twitching sound. He stopped at mid-step and one foot still in the air. The rattlesnake lay coiled beneath his foot. Its tail was pointing upward, rattling. Stanley backed his leg away, then turned and ran. The rattlesnake didn't chase after him. It was rattle its tail to warn him to stay away. Thanks for the warning, Stanley whispered as his heart pounded. The rattlesnake would not be a lot more dangerous if it didn't have a rattle. Hey, caveman, called Armpit. You still alive? What did the warden say? Asked X-Ray. What did you tell her? Asked Magnet. I just told her I stole the seeds, said Stanley. Good going, said Magnet. What did she do? Said Zigzag. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. Nothing. She got mad at Mr. Sir for bothering her. He didn't feel like going into details. He didn't want to talk about it, and then maybe it didn't happen. He went over to his hole, but his surprise was nearly finished. He stared at it, amazed. It didn't make sense, or perhaps it did. He smiled since he had to take the blame for the sunflower seeds. He realized the other boys had dug his hole for him. Hey, thanks, he said. Don't look at me, said X-Ray. Confused, Stanley looked around from Magnet to Armpit to Zigzag to Squid. None of them took credit for it, and then he turned to Zero, the one who quietly digging his hole since Stanley returned. Zero's hole was smaller than all the others. Chapter 22. Stanley was the first one finished. He spat in his hole, then shoved and changed into a cleaner set of clothes. It had been 3 days since laundry was done, so even his clean set was dirty and smelly. Tomorrow these would become his work clothes, and the other set would be washed. He could think no reason why Zero would dig his hole for him. Zero didn't even get any sunflower seeds. I guess he likes to dig holes, Armpit had said. He's a mole, Zigzag said. I think he eats dirt. Moles don't eat dirt, X-Ray had pointed out. Worms eat dirt. Hey, Zero, Squid had asked. Are you a mole or a worm? Zero said nothing. Stanley never even thanked him, but now he sat in his cot and waited for Zero to return to the shower room. Thanks, said Zero, entered through the tent flap. Zero glanced at him and then went over to the crates, where he disposed his dirty clothes and towel. Why'd you help me? Stanley asked. Zero turned around. You didn't steal the sunflower seeds, he said. So neither did you, said Stanley. Zero stared at him. His eyes seemed to expand, and it was almost as Zero were looking right through him. You didn't steal the sneakers, he said. Stanley said nothing. He watched Zero walk out of the tent. As if anybody had X-ray vision, it was Zero. Wait, he called, then hurried out after him. Zero had stopped outside of the tent, and Stanley almost ran into him. I'll try to teach you to read if you want, Stanley offered. I don't know if I know how to teach, but I'm not that worn out today, since you dug a lot of my hole. A big smile spread across Zero's face, and he turned to the tent and was less likely to be bothered. Stanley had got a box of stationery and a pen out of his crate. They sat on the ground. Do you know the alphabet? Stanley asked. For a second, he thought he saw a flash of defiance in Zero's eyes, but then he pressed. I think I know some of it, Zero said. A, B, C, D. Keep going, said Stanley. Zero's eyes looked upward. E, F, said Stanley. G, said Zero. He blew some air out of the side of his mouth. H, I, K, P. H-I-J-K-L, Stanley said. That's right, said Zero. I've heard it before, I just don't have it memorized exactly. That's all right, said Stanley. Here, I'll say the whole thing, just to refresh your memory. Then you could try it. He recited the alphabet for Zero, then Zero repeated it out without a single mistake. Not bad for a kid who's never seen Sesame Street. Well, I've heard it before somewhere, Zero said, trying to act like it was nothing, but he gave his big smile and gave him away. The next step was harder. Stanley had to figure out how to teach him to recognize each letter. He gave Zero a piece of paper and took a piece for himself. I guess we'll start with A. He printed as a capital A, and then Zero copied it on a sheet of paper. The paper wasn't lined, which made it a little difficult, but Zero's A wasn't bad. It was just a little big. Stanley told him he needed to write smaller, or else they'd run out of paper real quick. Zero printed it smaller. Actually, there's two ways to write that each letter, Stanley said, as he realized this was going to even be harder than he thought. That's a capital A, but usually you only see small a. You only have capitals at the beginning of words, and only if it's in the start of a sentence. It is proper noun, like a name. Zero nodded as if he understood, but Stanley knew he had made very little sense. He printed a lowercase a, and Zero copied it. And there are 52, said Zero. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Instead of 26 letters, it was actually 52. Stanley looked at him, surprised. I guess that's right. How'd you figure that out, he asked. Zero said nothing. Did you add? Zero said nothing. Did you multiply? It's just how many there are, said Zero. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. He didn't even know Zero knew were 26 in the first place. How do you count them if you recited them? He had Zero write a few more upper and lowercase a's, and then he moved to capital B. It was going to take a long time, he realized. And then he teach me 10 letters a day, suggested Zero. 5 capitals, 5 smalls. After 5 days, I'd know them all. Except for the last day, I have to do 12. 6 capitals and 6 smalls. Again, Stanley stared at him, amazed as he was able to figure all that out. Zero must have thought I was starving for a different reason, because he said, I'll dig your part of the hole every day. I can dig about an hour. When you teach me for an hour, and since I'm faster digger anyways, our holes will be done at the same time. I won't have to wait for you. Okay, Stanley agreed. As Zero printed his B's, Stanley asked him if he figured out it would take 5 days. Did you multiply? Did you divide? It's just what it is, Zero said. It's good math, said Stanley. I'm not stupid, Zero said. I just know everybody thinks I am. I just don't like answering their questions. Later that day, he lay in his cot. Stanley reconsidered the deal he made with Zero, giving a break every day he had relief. But he knew X-Ray wouldn't like it. He wondered if there would be some way Zero could agree to dig part of X-Ray's holes as well. And then again, why would he? I'm the one teaching Zero. I need a break so I'll have the energy to teach him. I'm the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds. I'm the one who Mr. Sir is mad at. He closed his eyes and images from Warden's cabin floated in his head. Red fingernails, Mr. Sir writhing on the floor, flowered makeup kit. He opened his eyes. He suddenly realized there had been a gold tube before. He'd seen it in the mother's bathroom, and then seen it again in the warden's cabin. It was half of a lipstick container. KB. 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 He felt a jolt of astonishment. His mouth suddenly formed the name Kate Barlow, as he wondered why it could have been the kissing outlaw. Chapter 23. 110 years ago, Green Lake was the largest lake in Texas. It was full of clear blue water, and it sparkled like a giant emerald in the sun. It was especially beautiful in the spring, with peach trees which lined the shore, bloomed with pink and rose-colored blossoms. There was always town picnic on the 4th of July. They played games, danced, sing, swim to the lake, and keep cool. Prizes were awarded the best peach pie and peach jam. Special prize was given every year to Miss Catherine Barlow for her famous spiced peaches. No one even tried to make spiced peaches because they knew none would be as delicious as hers. Every summer, Miss Catherine had picked bushels of peaches and preserved them in jars with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other spices which she kept secret. The jarred peaches would last all winter. They probably would have lasted longer than that, but they were always eaten by the end of winter. It was said that Green Lake was heaven on earth, and was that Miss Catherine's spiced peaches were food for the angels. Catherine Barlow was the town's only school teacher. She taught in one old room schoolhouse, and old even then. The roof leaked, the windows wouldn't open, the door hung crooked on its bent hinges. It was a wonderful teacher, full of knowledge and full of life. The children loved her. She taught classes for the evening for adults, and many of the adults loved her as well. She was pretty. Her classes were often full of young men who were a lot more interested in the teacher than they were getting an education. But all they ever got was an education. One such young man was Trout Walker. His real name was Charles Walker, but everyone called him Trout because his 2 feet smelled like a couple of dead fish. It was entirely Trout's fault. He had an incurable foot fungus. In fact, it was the same foot fungus that 110 years later would afflict the famous ball player Clyde Livingston. But at least Clyde Livingston showered every day. "I take a bath every Sunday morning," Trout would brag, "whether I need to or not." Most everyone in town in Green Lake expected Miss Catherine to marry Trout Walker. He was the son of the richest man in the country. The family owned most of the peach trees, all the land on the east side of the lake. Trout often showed up at the night school and never paid attention. He talked in class, he was disrespectful to students around him, and he was loud and stupid. A lot of men in town were not educated. That didn't bother Miss Catherine. She knew they would spend most of their lives working on farms and ranches, but it hadn't much schooling. That was why she was there, to teach them. But Trout wouldn't want to learn. He seemed to be proud of his stupidity. "How'd you like to take a ride on a new boat this Saturday?" he asked one of her evening after class. "No, thank you, Miss Catherine. We got a brand new boat," he said. "You don't even have to row it." "Yes, I know," Miss Catherine said. Everyone in town had seen and heard the Walker's new boat. It had been horrible, loud noises spewed ugly black smoke over the beautiful lake. Trout had always gotten everything he ever wanted. He found it hard to believe that Miss Catherine had turned him down. He pointed his finger at her and said, "No one ever says no to Charles Walker." "I believe I just did," said Catherine Barlow. Chapter 24. Stanley was half asleep as he got in line for breakfast, but in the sight of Mr. Sir awakened him. The left side of Mr. Sir's face was swollen the size of the half of a cantaloupe. There were 3 dark purple jagged lines running across the cheek where the warden had scratched him. The other boys, Stanley had obviously seen Mr. Sir as well. but they had a good sense not to say anything. Stanley put a carton of juice and plastic spoon on his tray. He kept his eyes down and hardly breathed as Mr. Sir ladled some oatmeal-like stuff into his bowl. He brought his tray to the table behind him. A boy from one of the attendants said, "Hey, what happened to your face?" There was a crash. Stanley turned to see Mr. Sir holding the boy's head against the oatmeal pot. "Is something wrong with my face?" The boy tried to speak, but didn't. Mr. Sir had him by the throat. "Does anyone see anything wrong with my face?" asked Mr. Sir as he continued to choke the boy. Nobody said anything. Mr. Sir let the boy go. His head banged against the table. He fell to the ground. Mr. Sir stood over him and asked, "How does my face look to you now?" A gurgling sound came from the boy's mouth when he managed to gasp the word, "Fine. I'm kind of handsome, don't you think?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." On the lake, the other boys asked Stanley when he knew about Mr. Sir's face, but he just shrugged and dug his hole, as if he didn't want to talk about it. Maybe it would go away. He worked as hard and as fast as he could, not trying to pace himself, but wanted to get off the lake and away from Mr. Sir as soon as possible. Besides, he knew he wouldn't get a break. "Whenever you're ready, just let me know," Zero had said, the first time when the water truck came, and it was driven by Mr. Budensky. The second time, Mr. Sir was driving. No one said anything except, "Thank you, Mr. Sir," as he filled each canteen. No one even dared to look at his grotesque face. As Stanley waited, he ran his tongue over the roof on his mouth and inside his cheek. His mouth was dry and as parched as the lake. The bright sun reflected off the side mirror of the truck, and Stanley got a shield his eyes from his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Sir," said Magnet as he took his canteen from him. "You thirsty, caveman?" Mr. Sir asked. "Yes, Mr. Sir," Stanley said, handing the canteen to him. Mr. Sir opened the nozzle. The water flowed out of the tank, but it did not go into Stanley's canteen. Instead, he held the canteen right next to the stream of water. Stanley watched the water splatter into the dirt, where it was quickly absorbed with the thirsty ground. Mr. Sir let the water run for about 30 seconds and stopped. "You want more?" he asked. Stanley didn't say anything. Mr. Sir turned the water back on, and again Stanley watched it pour into the dirt. "There should be plenty," he added Stanley's empty canteen. Stanley stared at the dark spot on the ground, which slightly shrank before his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Sir," he said. Chapter 25. There was a doctor in town of Green Lake 110 years ago. His name was Dr. Hawthorne, and whenever people got sick, they would go to see Dr. Hawthorne, but they would also see Sam, the Onion Man. "Onion, sweet fresh onion," Sam would call as his donkey Mary Lou walked it down the dirt roads of Green Lake. Mary Lou pulled a cart full of onions. Sam's onion field was somewhere on the other side of the lake. Once or twice a week, he would row across the lake and pick a new batch and fill the cart. Sam had big, strong arms, but it would still take all day for him to row across the lake and another day for him to return. Most of the time, he would leave Mary Lou in the shed, which the walkers let him use at no charge, but sometimes he would take Mary Lou on his boat with him. Sam claimed that Mary Lou was almost 50 years old, which was, and still is, extraordinarily old for a donkey. "She eats nothing but raw onions," Sam would say, holding up the white onion between his dark fingers. "It's nature's magic vegetable. If a person ate nothing but raw onions, he could live to be 200 years old." Sam was much older than 20, so nobody was quite sure what Mary Lou was really as old as he said he was. How would he know? Still, nobody ever argued with Sam, and whenever they were sick, they would go not only to Doc Arthur, but to Sam. Sam always gave the same advice: eat plenty of onions. He said that onions were good for the digestion, the liver, the stomach, the lungs, the heart, and the brain. If you don't believe me, just look at old Mary Lou there. She's never been sick a day in her life. She also had many different ointments, lotions, syrups, and pastes all about onion juice and different parts of the onion plant. This is one cured asthma, the other one has warts and pimples, other is remedy for arthritis, and even a special ointment which claimed to cure baldness. Just rub it on your husband's head every night when he's sleeping, Mr. Colwood, and soon his hair will be thick as long as Mary Lou's tail. Doc Hawthorne did not resent Sam. The folks of Great Lake were afraid to take chances. They would get regular medicine from Doc Hawthorne and an onion consultations from Sam. After they got over their illness, no one would be sure, not even Doc Hawthorne, which of the two treatments had done the trick. Doc Hawthorne was almost completely bald, and in the morning his head was smelled of onions. Whenever Catherine Barlow brought onions, she always bought an extra one or two and would let Mary Lou eat them out of her hand. "Is something wrong?" Sam asked her one day as she was feeding Mary Lou. "You seem distracted." "Oh, just the weather," said Miss Catherine. "It looks like rain clouds moving in." "Me and Mary Lou, we like the rain," said Sam. "Oh, I like it fine," said Miss Catherine. She rubbed Donkey's rough hair on the top of his head. "It's just that the roof leaks in the schoolhouse." "I can fix that," said Sam. "What are you going to do?" Catherine joked. "Fill the holes with onion paste." Sam laughed. "I'm good with my hands," he told her. "I built my own boat. If it leaked, I'd be in big trouble." Catherine didn't help but notice his strong, firm hands as he made the deal. He agreed to fix the leaky roof in exchange for 6 jars of spiced peaches. And it took Sam a week to fix the roof because he only had to work in the afternoons, after school let out and before night classes began. Sam wasn't allowed to attend classes, but he was a Negro, but they let him fix the building. Miss Catherine usually stayed in the schoolhouse, grading papers and such, but While Sam worked on the roof, he enjoyed what little conversation they were able to have, shouting up and down at each other. He was surprised at the interest in poetry. When he took a break, he would sometimes read a poem to him. One more on occasion, he would start to read a poem to Poe and Longfellow. They would only hear and finish hearing from memory. He was sad when the roof was finished. Is something wrong, he asked. No, you did a wonderful job, he said. It's just that the windows won't open. The children and I would enjoy the breeze now and then. I can fix that, said Sam. She gave him 2 more jars of peaches, and Sam fixed the windows. It was easier to talk to him when he was working on the windows. He told her a secret onion field on the other side of the lake. It's where the onions grow all year round and water runs uphill. And then the windows were fixed. She complained that her desk wobbled. I can fix that, said Sam. The next time she saw him, she mentioned that the door wasn't hanging straight, and he got to spend another afternoon with him while she fixed the door. By the end of the first semester, Onion Sam had turned the whole rundown house into a well-crafted, freshly painted jewel of the building that the whole town was proud of. People passing by would stop to admire it. That's our schoolhouse. It shows how much we value education here in Green Lake. The only person who wasn't happy was Miss Catherine. She'd run out of things needing to be fixed. She sat at her desk one afternoon listening to pitter-patter of the rain on the roof. No water leaked into the classroom except for a few drops that came into her eyes. Onions, hot sweet onions, Sam called out on the street. She ran to him, wanted to throw her arms around him, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she hugged Mary Lou's neck. Is something wrong? He asked her. Oh, Sam, she said, my heart is breaking. I can fix that, said Sam. He turned to him. He took both her hands and kissed her. Because of the rain, there was nobody else out in the street. Even if there was, Catherine and Sam would have noticed. They were lost in their own world. At the moment, however, Haiti Parker stepped out of the general store. They didn't see her, but she saw them. She pointed at her quivering figure in the direction and whispered, God will punish you. Chapter 26. There are no telephones, but word spread quickly through the small town. By the end of the day, everyone in Green Lake had heard a school teacher had kissed the onion picker. Not one child showed up to school the next morning. Miss Catherine sat alone in the classroom, wondering if he had lost track of the day of the week. Perhaps it was Saturday. It wouldn't have surprised her. Her brain and heart had been spinning ever since Sam kissed her. She heard a noise outside the door. Then suddenly a mob of men and women came storming into the school building. They were all led by Trout Walker. There she is, Trout shouted, the devil woman. The mob was turning over desks and ripping down the bulletin boards. She's been poisoning our children's brains with books, Trout declared. They began pulling all the books in the center of the room. Think about what you're doing, cried Miss Catherine. Someone had grabbed her, tearing her dress, but she managed to get out of the building. She ran over to the sheriff's office. The sheriff had his feet up at his desk and drinking a bottle of whiskey. Morning, Miss Catherine, he said. Destroy my schoolhouse, she said, gasping for breath. They'll burn it to the ground if no one doesn't stop them. Just calm your pretty self down, the sheriff said with a soul withdrawal. And let me see what you talk about. He got up to his desk and walked over. Trout Walker has. Now, don't go say anything bad about Charles Walker, said the sheriff. We don't have much time, urged Catherine. You gotta stop him. You're sure pretty, said the sheriff. Miss Catherine stared at him in horror. Kiss me, said the sheriff. She slapped him across the face. He laughed. You kissed the onion picker, why don't you kiss me? He tried to slap him again, but she caught her by the hand. He tried to wiggle free. You're drunk, she yelled. I'm always get drunk before a hanging. A hanging who? It's against the law for a Negro to kiss a white woman. Well, then you have to hang me too, said Catherine, because I kissed him back. I ain't against the law for you to kiss him, said the sheriff, explained. It's just for him to kiss you. We're equal under the eyes of God, she declared. The sheriff laughed. Then if Sam and I are equal, why won't you kiss me? He laughed again. I'll make you a deal. Once we kiss and I won't hang your boyfriend. I'll just run him out of town. Miss Catherine jerked her hand free. As she hurried to the door, she heard the sheriff say, the law will punish Sam and God will punish you. She stepped back into the street and saw smoke rising in the schoolhouse. She ran to the lakefront where Sam was hitching Mary Lou for the onion cart. Thank God I found you, she sighed, hugging him. We've got to get out of here now. What? Someone had been kissing yesterday, she said. They're going to set fire to the schoolhouse. The sheriff is going to hang you. Sam hesitated for a moment, and he couldn't quite believe it. He didn't want to believe it. Come on, Mary Lou. We have to leave Mary Lou behind, said Catherine. Sam had stared a moment, his tears in his eyes. Okay. Sam's boat in the water, tied to a tree by a long rope. He untied it, and they waded through the water and climbed aboard. His powerful arms rowed them away from the shore. But his powerful arms were no match for Trout Walker's motorized boat. They were a little more halfway across the lake when Miss Catherine heard a loud roar in the engine, and she saw ugly black smoke. These are the facts. The Walker boat smashed into Sam's boat. Sam was shot and killed in the water. Catherine Barlow was rescued against her wishes. Then they turned to shore. She saw Mary Lou's body laying on the ground. The donkey had been shot in the head. What all had happened 110 years ago. Since then, one drop of rain has fallen on Green Lake. You make the decision, who did God punish? 3 days after Sam's death, Miss Catherine shot the sheriff while she was sitting in a chair drinking a cup of coffee, and she carefully applied a fresh coat of red lipstick and gave him a kiss as he asked for. For the next 20 years, kissing Kate Barlow was one of the most feared outlaws in all the West. Chapter 27. Stanley shoved a shovel into the ground. The hole was about 3.5 feet deep in the center. He grinded out his pride over the dirt, then flung it off to the side. The sun was almost directly overhead. He glanced at the canteen lying on the side of his hole. He knew it was half full when she didn't take a drink just yet. He had to drink sparingly, because he didn't know who would be driving the water truck the next time it came. 3 days had passed, and the warden had scratched Mr. Sir. Every time Mr. Sir delivered water, he poured Stanley straight into the ground. Unfortunately, Mr. Budensky delivered the water more often than Mr. Sir. Mr. Budensky was obviously aware of what Mr. Sir was doing, because he was always gave Stanley a little extra. He filled the Stanley's canteen, then let Stanley take a long drink, then stop it off for him. It helped, too, that Zero was digging some of Stanley's hole for him. Although, as Stanley expected, the other boys did not like seeing Stanley sitting around while they were working. They sang things like, "Who died and made you king?" or "It must be nice to have your own personal slave." And then he tried to point out that he was the only one who took blame for the sunflower seeds. The other boys said it was his fault because he had the one spilled them. "I risked my life to get those seeds," Magnet had said, "and all I got was one lousy handful." Stanley also tried to explain that he needed to save his energy and reach Zero how to read. But the other boys had just mocked him. "Same old story, ain't it, Armpit?" X-Ray had said. "The white boy sits around while the black boy does all the work. Ain't that right, Caveman?" "No, that's not right," Stanley replied. "No, it ain't," X-Ray agreed. "It ain't right at all." Stanley dug out another shovelful of dirt. He knew X-Ray wouldn't have been talking if he was one teaching Zero to read. The next X-Ray would be talking about how important it is he got his rest, right? So he would be a better teacher, right? And if that was true, he'd need to save his strength so he could be a better teacher. Although Zero was a quick learner, sometimes in fact Stanley hoped the warden was watching them and the secret cameras and microphones so she would know that Zero was as stupid as everyone thought. From across the lake she would see the approaching dust cloud, and he took a drink from his canteen. Then waited to see who was driving the truck. The swelling on Mr. Sir's face had gone down, but it was still a little puffy. There had been 3 scratch marks down his cheek. 2 of the marks had faded, but the middle scratch must have been the deepest because it still remained. It was a jagged purple line running below his eye and below his mouth, like a tattoo of a scar. Stanley waited in line, then handed him his canteen. Mr. Sir held it up his ear and shook it. He smiled at the swishing sound. Stanley hoped it would dump it out. To his surprise, Mr. Sir held his canteen on a stream of water and filled it. "Wait here," he said. Still holding Stanley's canteen, Mr. Sir walked past him and then walked around the side of the truck and into the cab, where he wouldn't be seen. "What's he doing in there?" asked Zero. "I wish I knew," said Stanley. A short while later, Mr. Sir came out of the truck and handed Stanley his canteen. It was still full. "Thank you, Mr. Sir." Mr. Sir smiled at him. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "Drink up." He popped some sunflower seeds into his mouth, chewed, and spit out the shells. Stanley was afraid to drink it, but he hated to think what kind of vile substance Mr. Sir might have put in it. He brought the canteen back to its hole. For a long time he left it beside his hole and began to dig. Then when he was thirsty, he so hardly stayed anymore. He unscrewed the cap, turned the canteen over, and poured it over into the dirt. When he drank, afraid he waited for another second, he might have taken a drink. After Stanley caught 6 letters of the alphabet, he taught him to write his name. Capital Z-E-R-O. Zero wrote the letters. Stanley said to him, "Zero," he said, looking at the piece of paper. His smile was so big for his face. Stanley watched him write it over again, 0000000. In a way that made him sad. He couldn't help think, but 100 times 0 was still nothing. "You know, that's not my real name," Zero said as they headed to the rec room for dinner. "Well, yeah," Stanley said. "I guess I knew that," he said. He'd never been sure. "Everyone's always called me Zero, even before I came here." "Oh, okay. My real name's Hector." "Hector," Stanley repeated. "Hector Zeroni." Chapter 28. After 20 years, Kate Barlow returned to Camp Greed Lake and was a place where nobody would ever find her. A ghost town and a ghost lake. The peach trees had all died, but there were still a couple small oak trees still growing by an old abandoned cabin. The edge of the lake was over 5 miles away, and was a little over a small pond full of dirty water. She lived in a cabin beside. She could hear Sam's voice echoing across the emptiness. "Onions, sweet fresh onions." She knew she was crazy. She knew she'd been crazy for the last 20 years. "Oh, Sam," she would say, speaking through the vast emptiness. "I know it is hot, but I feel so very cold. My hands are cold, my feet are cold, my face is cold, my heart is cold." But sometimes she would hear him say, "I can fix that," and she'd feel his warm arm across her shoulders. She had been living in the cabin for about 3 months when she was waked one morning by someone kicking open the cabin door. She opened her eyes to see a blurry end of a rifle 2 inches from her nose. She could smell the Trout Walker's dirty feet. "You've got exactly 10 seconds to tell me where you've hidden your loot," said Trout, "or else I'll blow your head off." She yawned. The red-headed woman was there with Trout. Kate would see rummaging through the cabin, dumping drawers and knocking cameras of the cabinets. The woman came to her. "Where is it?" she demanded. "Linda Miller," asked Kate. "Is that you?" Linda Miller had been in the 4th grade when Kate Barlow was still a teacher. She had been a cute, freckle-faced girl with beautiful red hair. Now her face was blotchy and her hair was dirty and scraggly. "It's Winder Walker now," said Trout. "Oh, Linda, I'm so sorry," said Kate. Trout grabbed the throat of the rifle. "Where's the loot?" "There is no loot," said Kate. "Don't give me that. You robbed every bank from here to Houston." "You better call them," said Linda. "We're desperate." "You married him for his money, didn't you?" asked Kate. Linda nodded. "But it's all gone. It's dried up with the lake. The peach trees, the livestock. I kept thinking it was going to rain soon. The drought can't last forever." But it kept going hotter and hotter and hotter. Her eyes fixed in the shovel, which was leaning up against the fireplace. "She's buried it," she declared. "I don't know what you're talking about," asked Kate. And as a loud blast of his Trout fired a rifle above her head, the window behind her shattered. "Where is it buried?" she demanded. Go ahead and kill me, Trout, said Kate. But sure, I hope you like to dig, because you're going to be digging a long time. It's a big vast wasteland out here. You and your children, their children, could dig for the next 100 years and you'll never find it. Linda grabbed Katie's hair and jerked her head back. Oh, we're not going to kill you, she said. But by the time we're finished with you, you're going to wish you were dead. I've been wishing I was dead for the last 20 years, said Kate. They dragged her out of the bed and pushed her outside. She was born blue silk pajamas. Her turquoise strutted black boots remained beside her bed. She loosely tied her legs together so she could walk, but she couldn't run. She made her walk barefoot on the hot ground. They wouldn't help her stop walking. Not until you take us to the loot, said Trout. Linda Kate on the back of her legs with a shovel. You're going to take us to it sooner or later, so you might as well make it sooner. She walked one way to the other until her feet were black and blistered. Whenever she stopped, Linda whacked her with a shovel. I'm losing my patience, warned Trout. She felt the shovel drag her into her back, and she fell onto the ground dirt. Get up, ordered Linda. Kate struggled to her feet. We're getting easy on you today, said Trout. It's just going to keep getting worse and worse until you take us to it. Look out, shouted Linda. A lizard leaped toward him. Kate could see its big red eyes. Linda tried to hit it with a shovel, but Trout shot at it, but they both missed. The lizard landed on Kate's bare ankle, its sharp black teeth digging into her leg. Its white tongue lapped around the droplets of blood that leaked through the wound. Kate smiled. There's nothing they could do about it anymore. Start digging, she said. Where is it? Linda screeched. Why did you bury it? Tried to demand. Kate Barlow died laughing. Chapter 21. There was a change in the weather. For the worse. The air became unbearably humid. Stanley was drenched in sweat. Beads of moisture ran down the handle of the shovel. It was almost as if the temperatures had gotten so hot that the air itself was sweating. A loud boom of thunder echoed across the empty lake, a storm of the way of the west, beyond the mountains. Stanley could not count more than 30 seconds between the flash of the lightning and the clap of thunder. That was how far away the storm was. Sound travels great distance across a barren wasteland. Usually, Stanley couldn't see mountains at this time of the day. The only time they were visible was at sunup, before the air became hazy. Now, however, the sky was very dark to the west. Every time the lightning flashed, the dark shape of the mountains would briefly appear. Come on, rain, shouted Armpit. Blow this way. Maybe it'll rain so hard it'll fill up the whole lake, said Squid. We can go swimming. 40 days and 40 nights, said X-Ray. Guess we better start building us an ark. Get 2 of each animal, right? Right, said Zigzag. 2 rattlesnakes, 2 scorpions, 2 yellow-spotted lizards. The humidity, or maybe the electricity in the air, I made Zigzag's head even more wild-looking. His frizzy blonde hair stuck almost straight out. The horizon lit up with a huge web of lightning. In a split second, Stanley thought he saw an unusual rock formation on the top of one of those mountain peaks. The peak looked like a giant fist. It was a thumb sticking straight up. When it was gone, then Stanley wasn't sure whether he'd seen it or not. I found refuge on God's thumb. It was what his great-grandfather had supposedly said after Kate Barlow had robbed him and had left him stranded in the desert. No one ever knew what he meant by that. He was delirious when he said it. But, you know, to live for 3 weeks without food or water, Stanley had asked his father. I don't know. I wasn't there. Or at his father. I wasn't born yet. My father wasn't born yet. My grandmother, your great-grandmother, was nursing in the hospital where they treated him. They'd always talk about how he'd dab his forehead in cool wet cloth. That's why he fell in love with her. He thought she was an angel. A real angel? His father didn't know. What about after he got better? Did he ever say what he meant by God's thumb or how he survived? No, he just blamed his no-good pig-stealing father. The storm moved farther west, along with the hope of rain. It was the image of a fist and a thumb remained in the Stanley's head. Although, instead of lightning flashing behind the thumb, in Stanley's mind, lightning was coming out of the thumb, as if it were the thumb of God. Chapter 30. The next day it was Zigzag's birthday, or so he said. Zigzag lay in his cot as everyone headed outside. I get to sleep in because it's my birthday. Then a little while later he cut into the breakfast line in front of Squid. Squid told him to go to the end of the line. Hey, it's my birthday, Zigzag said, standing where he was. It's not your birthday, said Magnet, who was standing behind Squid. It's too, said Zigzag, July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what the day of the week it was, let alone the date. It would have been July 8th, but how would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out how long he'd been in Camp Green Lake if indeed it was July 8th. I came here on May 24th, he said out loud. So that means I've been here 46 days, said Zero. Stanley was trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He took the zero, he learned not to doubt it when it came to math. 46 days felt like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole that first day. He hadn't dug one yet today. That meant he dug 44 holes. If it really was July 8th, then I have an extra carton of juice, Zigzag asked Mr. Sir. It's my birthday. Trevor surprised. Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. Hole number 45. The 45th hole is the hardest, he said to himself. But it really wasn't true. He knew it. It was just a lot stronger than he first arrived. His body adjusted somewhat to the heat and harsh conditions. Mr. Sir was no longer depriving him of water after having by on less water for a week or so, Stanley now felt like he had all the water he wanted. Of course, it helped that Zero dug some of his hole for him each day, but it wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward while Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually, he stood around a while before sitting off by himself on the hard ground with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging, but not a lot better. When the sun came up a couple hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountains were little more than dark shadows on the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot on the top of the mountain to see that jut upward, but it doesn't seem very impassive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of the sun, reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that somewhere near the Cape Bartlett had robbed his great-grandfather. If that was her lipstick tube he'd found, then he'd just have to live somewhere around here. Zero took his turn before the lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole and Zero climbed down into it. "Hey, caveman," said Zigzag, "you should get a whip. When there's a slave that didn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back." "He's not my slave," said Stanley. "We have a deal, that's all." "A good deal for you," said Zigzag. "It was Zero's idea, not mine." "Don't you know, Zig?" said X-Ray, coming over. "Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero likes to dig holes." "He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him," said Squid. "Well, what about me?" asked Armpit. "I like to dig holes, too. Can I dig for you, Caveman, after Zero's finished?" The other boys laughed. "No, I want to," said Zigzag. "It's my birthday." Stanley tried his best to ignore them. Zigzag kept at it. "Come on, Caveman, be a pal. Let me dig your hole." Stanley smiled, as if it were all a big joke. Then Mr. Podensky arrived at the water and lunch. Zigzag offered Stanley in his place. "Since you're so much better than me," Stanley remained where he was. "I didn't say I was better. You're insulting him, Zig," said X-Ray. "Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman?" "No," said Stanley. "You sure are," said X-Ray. "Now come to the front of the line where you belong." "That's okay," said Stanley. "No, it's not okay," said X-Ray. "Get up here." Stanley hesitated, then moved to the front of the line. "Well, this is a first," Mr. Podensky said, coming around to the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him his sack of lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad he'd be digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him anymore. But he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into his sandwich, which contained some kind of meat-cheese mixture that came in a can. Just about everything at Camp Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came once a month. He glanced up at Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. "I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole," said Zigzag. Squid laughed. "Here, take my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it out for him. "No thanks," said Stanley. "Come on, take my cookie," said Zigzag, taking it in his face. "Leave me alone," said Stanley. "Please eat my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zigzag pushed him back. "Don't push me." "I didn't." Stanley got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Podensky was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. "I said, don't push me." Stanley took a backward, nearly avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, "Quit pushing." "Lay off," said Armpit, as he, Magnet, and X-Ray joined them. "Why should he?" snapped X-Ray. "Caveman's bigger. He can take care of himself." "I don't want any trouble," Stanley said. Zigzag pushed him hard. "Eat my cookie," he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Podensky's coming toward them along with Zero. "Hi, Mom," said Armpit. "We were just fooling around." "I saw what was going on," Mr. Podensky said. He turned to Stanley. "Go ahead, Stanley," he said. "Hit him back. You're bigger." Stanley stared at Mr. Podensky in astonishment. "Teach a bully a lesson," said Mr. Podensky. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with his open hand. "Teach me a lesson," he challenged. Stanley was a feeble attention upon Zigzag. Then he let his furry fist against the head of his neck. Zigzag had hold his collar in one hand and is hitting him in the other. The collar ripped and Stanley fell backward onto the dirt. "That's enough," Mr. Podensky yelled. It wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. "Stop," shouted Mr. Podensky. The side of Stanley's face was pressed flat against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fist slammed off his arms and pounded his face into the ground. All he could do was wait for it to be over. He looked up as he saw Zero with his arm around Zigzag's long neck. Zigzag made a gagging sound, and he desperately tried to pry Zero's arm off him. "You're going to kill him," shouted Mr. Podensky. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into him, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Podensky fired his pistol into the air. The other counselors came running from the office. The tents are out of the lake. They had their guns drawn, but holstered them when they saw trouble was over. The warden walked over to their cabin. There was a riot," Mr. Podensky told her. "Zero almost strangled Ricky." The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then he turned his attention to Stanley, who was obviously in worse condition. "What happened to you?" "Nothing. It wasn't a riot." Ziggy was beating up Caveman, said Armpit. Then Zero started choking Zigzag, and I had to pull Zero off Zigzag. It was all over before Mom fired his gun. They just got a little hot, that's all, said X-Ray. You know how it is, the sun all day, people get hot, right? But everything's cool now. I see, said Warden said, and turned to Zigzag. What's the matter? Didn't you get a puppy for your birthday? Zig's just a little hot, said X-Ray. In the sun all day? You know how it is, the blood starts to boil. Is that what happened, Zigzag? Asked the Warden. Yeah, said Zigzag. Like X-Ray said, working so hard in the hot sun while Caveman just sits around doing nothing, my blood boiled. Excuse me, said the Warden. Caveman digs his holes, just like everyone else. Zigzag shrugs. Sometimes. Excuse me? Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day, said Squid. The Warden looked at Squid and to Stanley to Zero. I'm teaching him to read and write, said Stanley. It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so it doesn't matter who digs it. Excuse me, said the Warden. It doesn't... And more important for him to learn to read, Stanley asked. Doesn't that build character more than digging holes? That's his character, said the Warden. What about your character? Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The Warden turned to Zero. What, Zero? What have you learned so far? Zero said nothing. Have you just been digging Caveman's hole for nothing? The Warden had asked him. He likes to dig holes, said Mr. Brudensky. Tell me what you learned yesterday, said the Warden. Surely you can remember that. Zero said nothing. Mr. Brudensky laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, you might as well teach his shovel to read. He's got more brains than Zero. The at sound, said Zero. The at sound, repeated the Warden. Well then tell me, what does C-A-T spell? Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley never knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. Cat, Zero said. Mr. Deskey clapped his hand. Bravo, bravo, the boy's a genius. F-A-T, asked the Warden. Zero thought for a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, Zero whispered. F, at, fat. How about H-A-T, asked the Warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Zero concentrated hard and then said, chat. All the counselors laughed. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Brudensky. He's so stupid, he doesn't even know he's stupid. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Brudensky seemed to have it for Zero. If Mr. Brudensky only thought about it, he realized it was logical for Zero to think the letter H was a CH sound. Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's hole, said the Warden. And no more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Good, said the Warden. She turned to Stanley. You know why you're digging holes? Because it's good for you. Teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole, then you're not learning your lesson, are you? I guess not, Stanley mumbled. Although he knew they weren't digging just to learn a lesson, she was looking for something that belonged to Kissing Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my own hole, but still teach Zero to read, he asked. What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, said the Warden. Said it leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, said Mr. Brudensky. I know you mean well, Stanley, but face it, Zero's too stupid to learn to read. That's what makes his blood boil, not the sun. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Mr. Brudensky handed him a shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you'll ever be good for. Zero took the shovel. Then he swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed across Mr. Brudensky's face. His knees crumpled beneath him. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. All counselors drew their guns. Zero had the shovel in front of him, as if he were going to try to bat away the bullets. I hate digging holes, he said. Then he slowly backed away. Don't shoot him, said the Warden. He can't go anywhere. The last thing we need is an investigation. Zero kept backing up with his blast of cluster of holes the boys had been digging, then farther and farther out into the lake. He's going to have to come back for water, the Warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground near his hole. A couple of counselors helped Mr. Brudensky to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out towards Zero, but he disappeared into the haze. The Warden ordered the counselors to take turns guarding the shower and rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. Then he returned as he brought directly to her. He examined her fingernails and said, It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of the Group D that they will be expected 7 holes. Chapter 31. Stanley angrily dug his hole into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Brudensky, the Warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather, but he mostly was angry at himself. He knew he never would have let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read. If Zero would dig all day, he would have the strength to learn. Then he should have been able to dig all day and have the strength to teach. What he should do, he thought, was to go out after Zero, but he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole, and now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out in the lake digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go out after Zero, but there was nobody to stop him. He kept thinking about what he should do. Maybe he could climb up to the top of a big thumb, if it wasn't too far away, and if it was really the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge, and if after 100 years ago water was still there. It didn't seem likely, not when an entire lake had gone dry. And even if he'd find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought they'd still have to come back eventually. Then they'd both have to face the warden and the rattlesnake fingers. Instead, he came up with a better idea. Although he didn't have quite it all figured out, he thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her he really found a gold tube if he wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make the deal out of getting himself in deeper trouble. She might just say, "Tell me where you found it or I'll scratch you too." Plus, it wouldn't mean X-Ray would get in trouble too. She'd probably scratch him up as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 60 months. He'd dig his shovel into the dirt. By next morning, Zero hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting guard the water spigot outside the shower hall. Mr. Podensky had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. "I always knew he was stupid," Stanley heard him say. Stanley was trying to dig only one hole the next day. As he dug, he kept constant watch out for Zero, but never saw him. Once again, he considered going out to the lake and look for him. Then he began to realize he was already too late. His only hope was Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-grandfather had found it, but for some reason his great-grandfather had felt the urge to climb to the top of the mountain. Maybe Zero would feel the same urge. If it wasn't the same mountain, if water was still there. He tried to convince himself it wasn't impossible. There had been a storm just a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It wasn't impossible. He turned to the tenant to find the warden, Mr. Sir and Mr. Podensky all waiting for him. "Have you seen Zero?" the warden asked him. "No." "No sign of it at all?" "No." "Do you have any idea where he went?" "No." "You know you're not doing him any favors if you're lying," said Mr. Sir. "He can't survive out there with more than a day or two." "I don't know where he is." All 3 stared at Stanley as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Podensky's face was still swollen. He could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. "You sure he has no family?" the warden asked Mr. Podensky. "He's a ward of the state," Mr. Podensky told her. "He was living on the streets when he was arrested. Is there anyone who might ask questions? Some social worker who took interest in him?" "He had nobody," said Mr. Podensky. "He was nobody." The warden thought for a moment. "Okay, I want you to destroy all of his records." Mr. Podensky nodded. "He was never here," said the warden. Mr. Sir nodded. "Can you get into the state files on your computer?" she asked Mr. Podensky. "I don't want anyone in the AG's office to know he was here." "I don't think I can erase him completely from the state files," said Mr. Podensky. "There's too many cross-references. But I can make it so it was very difficult for everyone to ever find the record of him. Like I said, though, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni." "Good," said the warden. Chapter 32. 2 days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian. But X-Ray called him Twitch, because he also is fidgeting. Twitch was assigned Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies didn't last long at Camp Green Lake. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hardwire the engine all in less than a minute. "I never planned to, steal one," he told them. "But sometimes, we walk past a real nice car, parked in the deserted area, and, I just start twitching. If you think I twitch now, you should see me when I'm around a car. Next thing I know, I'm behind the wheel, Stanley in the scratchy sheets." It occurred to him that his hot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away or if he had gotten used to it. "Hey, caveman," said Twitch. "Do we really have to get up at 4:30? "You get used to it," Stanley told him. "It's the coolest part of the day." He tried not to think about Zero. It was too late. Either he made it to Big Thumb or... What worried him the most, however, wasn't that it was too late. What worried him the most is that he ate wasn't in size, was the fear that it wasn't too late. What if Zero was still alive, desperately crawling across the dirt searching for water? He tried to force an image out of his mind. The next morning, out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told Twitch the requirements for his hole. "As wide and as deep as your shovel." Twitch fidgeted, his fingers drummed against the wooden shaft of the shovel, and his neck moved from side to side. "You won't be twitching so much after digging all day," Mr. Sir told him. "You won't have the strength to wiggle your pinky." He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, deftly chewed them, and spat out the shells. "This isn't a Girl Scout camp." A water trip came shortly after sunrise. Stanley got in line behind Magnet ahead of Twitch. What if it's not too late? He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot, dry dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive for more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He'd need a car. Or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water in the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir had left the keys in the ignition. He slowly backed away from the line, then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window. The keys were there, dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took the deep breath and readied himself to try to think clearly. He had never driven before. But how hard could it be? If it was really crazy, he told himself, whatever he did, he knew he would have to do it quickly before Mr. Sir noticed. It's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived. But what if it wasn't too late? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. There wasn't time to think. He flung over the door into the truck and climbed quickly inside. Hey, shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key and stepped in the gas pedal. The engine revved. The truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal on the floor. The engine roared, but the truck was motionless. Mr. Sir came running on the side of the truck. The door was open. Put it in gear, shouted Twitch. The gear shifted in the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back into the air and pointed the letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward. Stanley jerked back against the seat, tightly gripped the wheel, and the truck accelerated. His foot pressed on the floor. The truck went faster and faster across the dry lake bed. It bounced over a pile of dirt. Suddenly, Stanley was slammed forward, then instantly backward until the airbag exploded in his face. He fell in the open door and onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay in the dirt, staring at the truck with stuck lopsided into the ground. He sighed. He couldn't blame his no good, dirty, rotten pig stew and Gregory grandfather this time. This time it was his own fault. 100%. He had probably done the stupidest thing he had ever done in a short and miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore but didn't think he had broken any bones. He glanced back at Mr. Sir, who remained where he was, staring at Stanley. He ran. His canteen was strapped around his neck. It banged against his chest as he ran. Every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. Chapter 33. He slowed to a walk. As far as he could tell, nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices coming from the back by the truck, and he couldn't make out the words. Occasionally, he heard the revving of an engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He headed in what he thought was the direction of the big thumb. He couldn't see it through the haze. Walking helped him calm down, but allowed him to think clearly. He doubted he could make it to Big Thumb, but with no water in his canteen, he didn't want to risk his life on the hope that he'd find a refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that, but he was in no hurry. It would be better to return later, for after everyone had a chance to calm down. As long as he'd come this far, he might as well look for Zero. As long as he'd come this far, he might as well look for Zero. He decided he could walk as long as he could, until he was too weak to go any further. Then he'd turn around and go back. He smiled as he realized he wouldn't quite work. He could only go halfway as far as he thought he could go, and he'd still have its strength to return. Then he'd have to make a deal with the warden, tell her where he found Kate Laurel's whip soon and beg for mercy. He was surprised by how far out the holes extended. He couldn't even see the camp compound anymore, but he still kept passing holes. It was when he thought he'd passed the last hole when he came across another cluster of them, a little farther away. Back at the compound, they had dug in a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck, but out there was no system. It was every once in a while, in a fit of frustration, the warden would just pick a spot random and say, "What the hell, dig here." It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in a lottery. Stanley found himself looking down into the hole he passed. He didn't admit to himself that he was looking for. After more than an hour was gone by, he thought he had surely seen the last hole, but then off to the left he saw another cluster of them. He didn't actually see the holes, he saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole. His heart stopped. Down at the bottom was a family of yellow-spotted lizards. Their large red eyes looked up at him. He leapt back of the mountain and ran. He didn't even know they were chasing after him. He thought he might have seen one leap out of the hole. After he ran until he couldn't run any further, then collapsed. They hadn't come after him. He sat there a while and caught his breath. As he got back to his feet, he thought he noticed something on the ground, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like much, maybe it was a big rock, but in the land of nothingness, any little thing seemed unusual. He walked slowly toward it to counter the lizard that made him very cautious. It turned out to be an empty sack of sunflower seeds. He wondered if it was the same one Magnet had stolen from Mr. Sir, although it hadn't seemed likely. He turned it inside out and found one seed stuck to the burlap. Lunch. Chapter 34. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he would have to walk no more than another hour, maybe two, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see that there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all thirsty. Maybe he could just turn around now. Maybe he had already gone halfway and didn't know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened to make sure he wasn't imagining the pool, and the pool was still there. He hurried toward it. The pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising over the dry ground. He kept walking, still carried his empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if it might find something to put it in. After a while, he thought he could make out the shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if it was some other kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. Almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with his thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain. It was more than halfway. He kept walking toward it. Although he didn't know why, he knew he'd have to turn around before he got there. But every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him a thumbs-up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of his large object on the lake. He could tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. But it looked like a little fallen tree. Although it hadn't seemed likely a tree would grow around here. More likely it was a ridge of dirt and rocks. The object, whatever it was not in the way of Big Thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or continue toward Big Thumb, or maybe just turn around. There's no point in heading toward Big Thumb. He decided he would never make it. For all he knew, it was chasing a moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object. He changed directions. He doubted it was anything, but the fact that there's something in the middle of all this nothing made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object the halfway point, and he hoped he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of a dry and barren wasteland, but after all, he realized it was once a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could very well die of thirst. And the same of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled and faded, but Stanley could still read the name. Mary Lou. On the side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt and then a tunnel leading down below the dirt. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred under the boat and someone out. "Hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare back inside. His mouth was very dry. It was hard to shout very loud. "Hey!" the thing answered weakly. Then a dark hand and an orange sleeve reached up out of the tunnel. Chapter 35. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out for too many days past Halloween, half rotten, half sunken eyes with a drooping smile. "Is that water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale that they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not believing it was real. "I tried to bring you a whole water truck, but," he smiled sheepishly, "I drove it into a hole. I can't believe you're—" "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we gotta get back to camp." Zero shook his head. "I'm not going back." "You have to. We both have to." "You want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes forearm. "It's cooler under the boat," he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him and wasn't able to squeeze his body through the hole. He never would have fit when he first came to Camp Green Lake. He lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there, then remembered that Zero had taken it from striking Mr. Budensky. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt, with enough cracks and holes at the bottom of the boat now proof to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars shattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand, grunted, and tried to screw the lid. "What is it?" "Sploosh." His voice was strained and worked on the jar. "That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat." He couldn't get the lid off. "I found 16 jars here. Hand me a shovel." Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it at the Zero, blade first. "Sometimes you just have to," Zero said, and he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh of the jagged edges before it spilled. "Careful," Stanley warned. Zero picked up a cracked lid and licked the sploosh off as well. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. "Drink some." Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it for a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized it must have been in the boat after the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it? "It's good," said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar in his mouth and took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as flowed out of the dry mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it might have been some kind of fruit at the same time, perhaps peaches. Zero smiled at him. "I told you it was good." Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. "How many are left?" he asked. "None," said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. "Now I should have to take you back," he said. "I'm not digging any more holes," said Zero. "They won't make you dig," Stanley promised. "They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barfbag." "Barfbag stepped on a rattlesnake," said Zero. Stanley remembered how he almost done the same. "I guess he did hear the rattle." "He did that on purpose, Zero. You think?" He took off his shoe and sock first. Stanley shivered. He tried to imagine it. What's Maria Luou? Asked Zero. "What?" Zero concentrated hard. Mara Luou. "I have no idea." "I'll show you," said Zero. He crawled back out from under the boat. But Stanley followed. Back outside, and he had his shield aside from the brightness. Zero walked around the back of the boat and pointed the upside-down layer. "Mara Lou." Stanley smiled. "Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat." "Mary Lou," Zero repeated, studying the layers. "I got it. E makes a Y sound." "It does," said Stanley. But not when it's on the end of the word. Sometimes Y is a vowel and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. "Are you alright?" Zero grabbed to the ground and landed on his side with his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was like a sploosh. He looked back toward Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning as he slowly unbent. "I'm taking you back," said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. "Look, I got a plan and you won't get in trouble," Stanley assured him. "Remember when I found the old tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray when the warden went crazy making his dig when she thought X-Ray found it? I think I'd tell the warden where I actually found it. Then she would let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He had to come to rescue Zero. Instead, drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off into the distance. I want you to look at something. I'm not. I just want you to look at the mountain up there. You see the one that's something sticking up on it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? What does it look like? Anything? Zero said nothing. As he studied the mountain, his right hand only formed into a fist. He raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand, then back to the mountain. Chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in a burlap sack in case he might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack and Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said, I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other another thumbs up sign and headed to the hottest part of the day. Stanley, empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back of the water truck and wished he had at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero, another attack. He clutched his stomach and he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would take before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It wouldn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then using his shovel, pulled back to his feet. He gave Stanley a thumbs up sign. They continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, and wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it again, to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon, and if they ever reached it, he realized they would have to still climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It was hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Someone must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting on the boat while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used a shovel with a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I'd stop to rest, he said after a while, and Stanley looked at the Big Thumb and still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Cramp Green Lake or Big Thumb. Yeah, I really have to sit down. You see, if you can go a little, Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over his head to the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think he might need to dig a grave, Zero's last hole. And who would dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. He took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant. Then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded out for himself. Run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and weakness. He struck Stanley as well. The next time he looked up the Big Thumb, it really didn't seem closer. They quit spelling words and it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. It was weak and exhausted. Yet, as bad as it felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought. He hoped that he didn't get a bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in, either. Maybe the bacteria were only in the jars which opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in his sack. That scared Stanley the most about dying and his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than he felt now, in fact. Maybe at the moment of death he would be too weak to feel the pain. Death would be a relief. That worried him was most of his thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on the false hope for him at least, it would be over for his parents and the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It wasn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but if no one cared about Zero, they simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. He couldn't pretend he was never here. He wondered what he would tell them, and when. What do you think's up there? Zero asked. Stanley looked at the top of Big Thumb. Oh, probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want an ice cream sundae, said Zero, with nuts, whipped cream, and bananas and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumbs started up toward it. They came to an end of the lake. White, huge stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they'd been rocking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had somehow climbed up out of it. I know they could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, and he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, crawling down the hill. cliff. On either side of the road, there was a series of ledges. "Let's try there," he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars with his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it in the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave him a thumbs up sign. Stanley did the same. He looked above them. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 2 or 3, 4 feet outlook over his head, and he didn't see any footholds. It was straight look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero. "Then I'll pull you up with the shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Yes, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on the inner toe of a finger. It was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him below as Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack of the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed hold of the sack, then the shovel. He let the shovel go so half the blade was supported by a rock slab. The wooden shaft hung around Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted it would work, but one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight, and quite the other for Zero to try to pull him up. Stanley grabbed the hold of the shovel and he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one after the other, up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft in one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered the strength for the brief second, seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and, with Zero's help, pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He had it on the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. One of the glass jars was broken in the sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need it to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued on up. It was fairly easy to climb the rest of the way. When they reached the flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball glancing at the top of Big Thumb. God was throwing a basketball. Soon as they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. Chapter 37. "We're almost there," said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that he really were almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water, no refuge, then they would have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid they'd never started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they wouldn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began to appearing above the weed patches. The swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracting their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to try to swat at them. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up. Then he said, "If a gnat lands on me, it will knock me over." Stanley gave him a few words. "B-U-G-S," he spelled. Zero concentrated hard and then said, "Bugs?" Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as he spelled bugs, he said. "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, it's short U if there's no E in the end." "Okay, here's a hard one. How about L-U-N-C-H? Lun. Suddenly, Zero made a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently, and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths. Then he straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him much more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. 10-15 minutes later, Zero said lunch. As they climbed together higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be more careful not to get their feet tangled in thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "There's got to be water around somewhere. He must be getting close." A wide cloud-like smile spread across Zero's face. He finished a thumbs-up sign and fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs." Stanley shook him. "You've already ordered your hot fudge sundae," he said. "We're making it right now." Zero said nothing. Chapter 38. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled them upright. Then he stooped down to let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and the sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dragged in front of him. Stanley could see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and how impossible a task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself, and also seemed to come from outside as well. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was a rock that absorbed his energy and now acted like a kind of giant magnet pulling him toward it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first, he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be the air hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't as steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose ahead of him, but barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb, and he knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was bitter smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could it be water on top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only on an occasional rainstorm, like the only one he had seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it. If nothing else, he wanted to at least reach the thumb. He never made it. His fate slipped out from under him. Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. As he lay face down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. Had he come all this way just to? We need water to make mud. He crawled along the gully in a direction that seemed the muddiest. The ground became gloppier. The mud splashed up, and he slipped on the ground. Using both hands, he dug the hole in the soggy soil. It was dark to see, but he thought he could see a tiny pool of water at the bottom of the hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper as he did, and more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, first with his fingers and then with his tongue. He dug until he had a hole that was as deep as his arm was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked between his lips, searching out the droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug and scooped some water and let it pour out of his hands into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen the hole, his hand came across a smooth, round object with two smooth and two round rocks. He wiped the dirt off it and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burned his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyes, and then he swallowed. He felt the warmth move down to his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half. He gave the other half to Zero. "Here, eat this. What is it?" Zero whispered. "A hot fudge sundae." Chapter 39. Stanley woke in the meadow, looking up at the giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked in different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while, just looking at it. He doesn't have the strength to get up. It felt like his insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder, when he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water in his mouth and swished it around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth. He tried again. "How are you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and crawled out to the water hole. He lowered his head into it and lapped some water. He then jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Stanley thought he was going back to the mountain to look for a shovel, so he would make a better water hole deeper. Maybe that would give him cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But as he didn't think he would have the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again, and he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He had a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around Big Thumb. He took a deep breath, then walked at last 50 yards to a giant precipice and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead each flower was really a cluster of tiny little flowers that formed a round ball. He brought it to his mouth and had to spit it out. He could see part of a trail that made it night before. Then he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down to look for a shovel, he realized he should do it soon. While the trail was fresh, but he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero still lay doubled over on his side. "I gotta tell you something," he said in a groan. "Don't talk," said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes as his face twisted in pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," Stanley said. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, and then again he said, "I don't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter." It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. "Clyde Livingston's shoes?" "I'm sorry," said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero didn't was delirious. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles of his face relaxed as he drifted into sleep. Stanley softly sang him the song that has been in his family for generations. If only, the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, the cries of the moon. If only, if only. Chapter 40. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it would come to be there. He grated gratefully, but now he sat gazing at Big Thumb in the meadow full of flowers. He couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there would be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling up the entire plant, including the root. Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions, Sam called it as Mary Lou pulled the cart down the main street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color of the lake and the peach trees along its shore. Miss Gladys Tennyson was wearing just her nightgown and a robe, and she came running down the street after Sam. Mr. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman, who never went to the public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat. So it was quite surprising to the people at Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam," she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping his mule in a cart. "Good morning, Miss Tennyson," he said. "How's the little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you. I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserve most of the credit." "The good Lord, yes," agreed Miss Tennyson, "but not Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach." "Leeches? My word, he said that they would suck out the bad blood. Now you tell me, what would a leech now know good blood from bad blood?" "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Mrs. Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hardy Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," Miss Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know you're pleading about with the bedclothes?" Edie asked. There was more snickers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I'm dressed, thank you," said Miss Tennyson. "We've both been all up night, half a morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. Seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face blushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Miss Tennyson. "But it nearly killed Becca, and that's with her being so young. Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca was all right," Hattie said contrivedly. "I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself, then turned and quickly walked away. "Well, Becca, then when she feels up to come by the store a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Miss Tennyson brought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. "I don't take charity," Sam told her, "but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it." "All right then," said Miss Tennyson. "Give me my change of onions." Sam gave Miss Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept off, and their own next 2 days ate onions. All they wanted, splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make a hole deeper, but he really needed his shovel. His efforts seemed to stir up the mud and made the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak. Well, the sleep and the onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was asleep, and he didn't want him to wake up and think he'd been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go look for a shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep with the onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail that made 2 days earlier. There was a few places that he wasn't sure he was able to go right away, but it took a while of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a ways in the mountain, but still didn't find a shovel. He looked back toward the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There's no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from there. Still, he headed downward just in case. He came to a bare spot between 2 large patches of weeds and sat down to rest. Now he'd definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired out from walking down the hill. He would have been impossible to carry Zero up the hill from here, especially from walking all the way with no food or water. The shovel must have been buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in the low directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds a little farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely the shovel would be there, but he had already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, found the shovel and a stack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and the sack might have rolled down the hill. But none of the jars were broken, except one had broken earlier. And if they had rolled down the hill, it would be doubtful that he would find a sack and a shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. Chapter 41. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion. He liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now almost as large as the holes he had dug back in Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero had offered to help, but Stanley thought it better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in water than it was in a dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't got sick from either the sploosh, the dirty water, or living on the onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back home. Both boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks. All their clothes were very dirty. But their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks into the hole, afraid of contaminating the water. Instead, they filled the jars and poured water over their dirty socks. I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often, Zero said. Just if the weather was really bad. I'd have to find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I'd just gone by myself, they would have asked me a bunch of questions. If they found out I didn't have a mom, they would have made me a weird ward of the state. What was the ward of the state? Zero smiled. I don't know, but I didn't like the sound of it. Stanley remembered Mr. Podensky talking to the warden that Zero was the ward of the state. He wondered if Zero knew he'd become one. I liked sleeping outside, said Zero. I used to pretend I was a Cub Scout. I always wanted to be a Cub Scout. I'd see them in the park in their blue uniforms. I was never a Cub Scout, said Stanley. I was good at social stuff like that. Kids make fun of me because I was fat. I like blue uniforms, said Zero. Maybe I wouldn't have liked being a Cub Scout. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. My mother was once a Girl Scout, said Zero. I thought you said you didn't have a mother. Everybody has a mother. Well, yeah, I know that. She says she won a prize for selling the most Girl Scout cookies, said Zero. She was real proud of it. Stanley peeled off another layer of his onion. We always took what we needed, Zero said. When I was little, I didn't even know it was stealing. I don't remember when I found out, but she just took what we needed, never more. And when I saw the shoes on display in shelter, I reached for the glass case and took them. Clyde Livingston's shoes? She asked Stanley. I don't know what they were his. I just thought they were somebody's old shoes. It was better to take someone's old shoes, I thought, than steal a pair of new ones. I didn't know they were famous. There was a sign, but of course I couldn't read it. Then, the next thing I know, everyone's making this big deal about the shoes were missing. It was kind of funny in a way. The whole place is going crazy. There I was wearing the shoes, and everyone's running around saying, what happened to the shoes? The shoes are gone. I walked out the door. No one noticed me. Then I got outside. I ran to the corner and immediately took off the shoes, put them on top of a parked car. I remember they smelled really bad. Yeah, those were them, said Stanley. Did they fit you? Pretty much. Stanley remembered being surprised at Clyde Livingston's small shoe size. Stanley's shoes were bigger. Clyde Livingston had small, quick feet. Stanley's feet were big and slow. I should have just kept them, said Zero. I already made it out of the shelter and everything. I ended up getting arrested the next day when I tried to walk out of a shoe store with a new pair of sneakers. If I had just kept those old smelly sneakers, then neither of us would be here right now. Chapter 42. Zero became strong enough to help dig the hole. Then he finished. It was over 6 feet deep. He filled the bottom with rocks that helped separate the water from the dirt. It was still the best hole digger around. That's what the last hole I ever dig, he declared, throwing down a shovel. Stanley smiled. He wished it were true, but he knew they had no choice but eventually return to Camp Green Lake. They wouldn't live on onions forever. Tene had been completely around Big Thumb. It was a giant sundial. They followed the shade, as if they were to see out all directions. There was no place to go. The mountain was surrounded by desert. Zero stared at Big Thumb. There must have been a hole in it, he said, filled with water. You think? Where else would the water be coming from? Zero asked. Water doesn't run uphill. Stanley bit into an onion. They didn't burn his eyes or nose, and in fact, he no longer noticed a particularly strong taste. He remembered that when he first carried Zero up the hill, how the air had smelled bitter, and it's the smell of 1,000 of onions, growing and rotting and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. How many onions do you think we've eaten? He asked. Zero shrugged. I don't even know how long we've been here. I'd say about a week, said Stanley, and we probably each eat about 20 onions a day, so that's 280 onions, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I bet we'll really sink. 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake, staring up at the star-filled sky. He was so happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He just heard or read somewhere that right before a person freezes to death, he suddenly feels nice and warm. He wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just getting sent to Camp Green Lake it made his life miserable. Before that, he had been unhappy at school, where he had no friends and boys like Derek Dunn picked on him. No one liked him. And the truth is, he really didn't especially like himself. He liked himself now. He wondered if he was delirious. He took a look over at Zero sleeping near him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight, but there was a flower petal in front of his nose that moved back and forth as he breathed. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in, and the petal was drawn up, almost touching his nose. Zero breathed out, and the pedal moved toward his chin. It stayed on Zero's face for an amazingly long time before floating off to the side. Stanley considered placing it back on front of Zero's nose, but it wouldn't be the same. It seemed like Zero had lived at Camp Green Lake forever, but Stanley thought about it now. He realized that Zero must have gotten there no more than a month or two before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered that Zero had said a few days before, if Zero would have kept the shoes, neither of them would be there right now. As Stanley stared at the glittering night sky, he thought there was no place he would rather be. He was glad Zero put the shoes in the parked car. He was glad they fell in the overpass and hit him on the head. Then the shoes first fell from the sky. He remembered thinking of the destiny that struck them. Now he thought so again. It was more than a coincidence. It had been to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they would just make it past the camp. Then follow the dirt road back to civilization. They would fill their sack with onions and 3 jars with water, and he had his canteen as well. They would refill the jars and canteen of the camp, maybe sneak into the kitchen and get some food. He doubted any counselors were still on guard. Everyone would think they're dead. Buzzard food. It would mean living the rest of their life as fugitive. The police would always be after them. At least he could call his parents and tell them he was alive. He couldn't go visit them in case the police were watching the apartment. Although if everyone would thought he was dead, they wouldn't bother to watch the apartment. He would have somehow get a new identity. Now I'm really thinking crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even when he thought this, an even crazier idea kept popping into his head. He knew it would be too crazy to even consider. Still, if he was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money, perhaps a treasure chest full of money. You're crazy, he told himself. Besides, it's because he found a lipstick container with KB on it that didn't mean there was treasure buried here. It was crazy that all parts of crazy feeling of happiness. Maybe it was destiny. He reached over and shook Zero's arm. Hey, Zero, he whispered. Huh, Zero muttered. Zero, wake up. What? Zero raised his hand. What is it? You want to dig one more hole? Stanley asked him. Chapter 43. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you, Stanley started to ask, but couldn't find the right words. Moved out. I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrist and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me, the one you sang. It was different, though. Zero spoke slowly, as if searching his brain for memories and clues. And if later I know we lived on the street. But I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. Oh, I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave the first hint of daylight, so they had plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure to find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig along as it seemed safe, and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save his strength through the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk what he felt like it. Stanley thought of his own parents. In her last letter, Mom was worried that he might have been evicted from their apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they were told that he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he had the night before, the inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dunked their caps in a water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel, and Stanley carried a sack, with it crammed with onions and 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of broken jar in the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing out a patch in the weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted his sack under one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, and fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down a steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack and onions spilled around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but slowed him enough that he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned and pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars than water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them. They're like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do what you were carrying me, Zero said, and they had lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was rising above the lake. They walked directly toward it. Soon they stood at the edge of a cliff, looking down on the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it became kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. That was a different spot from where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down the ledge to another and let themselves slide into their place, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but had thought he was the right direction as the sun rose just did a familiar haze of the heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, you'll lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for seemed like a very long time and still never came across Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that they left the boat. They were headed toward the setting sun. Now that they were heading toward the rising sun, he knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, nor more southwest, northeast, and southwest. But he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if he was coated with sandpaper. You sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero was now carrying the sack, set it down, and took 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to leave the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. You know, I'm not thirsty, Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. I'm just drinking so you will. I'm not just drinking so you will, said Zero. They clinked the jars together and, each watching the other, poured water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away, and it was just a little out of sight, to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero had explained things to himself. He'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her. Then when I was real little, I would wait in small areas, like on a porch step or a doorway. Now don't leave me here until I get back, she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I hugged it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block, or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jaffy. Stanley guessed that Jaffy was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Langley Park. Langley Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape, said Zero. Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left the camp, I was heading straight for Big Thumb, he said. I saw a boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Okay, he said. They headed out. It was only Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, Zero said. Guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked to be the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though I wasn't their playscape. There was one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake. But then the same mother told me go away, and she told all the kids to stay away from me. So I never got my piece of cake, and I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffy. Did you ever find him? For a moment, Zero didn't answer, and he said he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know he was dead or alive. He realized that how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero had never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero thought, abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. We were heading toward Big Thumb, then you saw the boat off to your right, said Zero. That means we should have turned right when we left the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, Zero said, drawing a last line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed, but it didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was welcoming relief. Once again, Stanley felt the destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held his arm to stop Stanley too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but they could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, they occasionally would hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. As they walked slowly and quietly, aware of the sounds travel in both directions, they approached the cluster of holes. "Let's wait here until they go in," said Zero. Stanley nodded. They checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into the hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading the Stanley in his hole. He waited until the last campers had finished for the day. Then he waited for a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept toward the camp. Stanley held a sack in front of him, cradled it in his arms, instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clanking against each other. The wave of terror rushed over him when he saw a compound, the tents, the rec room, and the warden's cabin under 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. "That's the one," he whispered, pointing at the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down to an adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. Chapter 44. Stanley tried to sleep, but not knowing he would get the chance again. He heard the showers and later the sounds of dinner. He heard the creaking in the rec room door. His fingers drummed against the side of the hole. He heard his own heartbeat. He took a drink from the canteen. He had given Zero the water jars. They each had a good supply of onions. He wasn't sure how long they remained in the hole, maybe 5 hours. He was surprised when he heard Zero whispering for him to wake up. He didn't think he'd fallen asleep. If he had, he must have thought it must have been like 5 minutes. Although, when he opened his eyes, he was surprised how dark it was. There was only one light at the camp, in the office. The sky was cloudy, so there was very little starlight. Stanley could see a silver of the moon, which appeared to be disappeared among the clouds. He carefully led Zero to the hole, which was part of fine in the darkness. He stumbled over a small pile of dirt. "I think this is it," he whispered. "You think?" Zero asked. "This is it," said Stanley, sounding more certain than he really was. He climbed down. Zero handed him a shovel. Stanley stuck the shovel into the dirt in the bottom of the hole and stepped back at the blade. He felt it sink beneath its weight. He scooped up some dirt and tossed it off to the side. Then he brought the shovel back down. Zero watched for a while. "I'm going to try to refill the water jars," he said. Stanley took a deep breath and exhaled. "Be careful," he said, and continued digging. It was so dark he couldn't even see the end of his shovel. For all he knew, he was digging up golds and diamonds instead of dirt. He brought each shovel close to his face to try to see if anything was there, before dumping it into another hole. As he made the hole deeper, it became harder to lift the dirt up and out. It was 5 feet deep before he even started. He decided to use his efforts to make it wider instead. This made more sense, he told himself. If Kate Barlow had buried the treasure, she probably wouldn't have been able to dig much deeper, so why should he? Of course, Kate Barlow probably had a whole gang of thieves helping her. "You want some breakfast?" Stanley jumped in the sound of Zero's voice. He hadn't heard him approach. Zero handed down a box of cereal. Stanley carefully poured some cereal into his mouth. He didn't want to put his dirty hands inside the box. He nearly gagged an ultra-sweet taste. There was sugar-frosted flakes, and after eating nothing but onions for more than a week, he had trouble adjusting to the flavor. He washed them down with a swig of water. Zero took over the digging. Stanley sifted his fingers through the fresh piles of dirt in case he missed anything. He wished he had a flashlight. A diamond no bigger than a pebble would be worth thousands of dollars. Yet there was no way to see it. He finished the water, as Zero had forgotten from the spigot by the shower. Stanley said he'd go fill the jars again, but Zero insisted that he do it instead. "No offense, but you make too much noise when you walk. You're too big." Stanley returned to the hole. His hole grew wider. Parts of the surface kept caving in. They were running out of room. And make it much wider, they first had to make move some of the surrounding dirt piles out of the way. He wondered how much time they had before the camp woke up. "How's it going?" Zero asked when he returned with the shovel. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. He brought the shovel down to the side of the hole, shaving off a slice of dirt wall. As he did so, he felt the shovel bounce off something hard. "What was that?" Zero asked. Stanley didn't know. He moved the shovel up and down inside of the hole. As the dirt chipped and flaked away, the hard object became more pronounced. It was sticking out of the side of the hole, about 1.5 feet from the bottom. He felt it with his hands. "What is it?" Zero asked. He could just feel the corner of it. Most of it was still buried. It had the cool, smooth texture of metal. "I think I might have found a treasure chest," he said. His voice was filled with more astonishment than excitement. "Really?" asked Zero. "I think so," Stanley said. The hole was wide enough for him to hold the shovel lengthwise and dig sideways into the wall. He knew he had to dig very carefully. He didn't want the side of the hole to collapse. Along the huge pile of dirt directly above it, he scraped the dirt wall until he exposed more of the side of the box-like object. He ran his fingers over it. It felt to be about 8 inches tall and almost 2 feet wide. He had no way of knowing how far into the earth it extended. He tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't budge. He thought about that, and the only thing he could get is to start back at the surface and dig down. They didn't have time for that. I'm going to try to dig the hole underneath it, he said. Then maybe I can pull it down and slip it out. Go for it, said Zero. Stanley zipped the shovel into the bottom edge of the hole and carefully began to dig the tunnel underneath the metal object. He hoped it didn't cave in. Occasionally he stooped down and tried to feel the far end of the box, but even when the tunnel was long as an arm, he couldn't feel the other side. Once again he tried pulling it out, but firmly in the ground. He pulled too hard, he feared it would cause a cave-in. He knew it wasn't ready to pull out. He would have to do it quickly before the ground above it collapsed. As the tunnel grew deeper and wider, the more precarious. Stanley was able to feel latches on the end of the box and then a leather handle. It was really a box. I think it might be some kind of metal suitcase, he told Zero. Don't pry it too loose with a shovel, Zero suggested. I'm afraid the side of the hole will collapse. You might as well give it a try, said Zero. Stanley took a sip of water. Might as well, he said. He forced the tip of the shovel between the dirt and the top of the metal case and tried to wedge it free. He wished he could see what he was doing. He worked at the end of the shovel back and forth, up and down, until he felt the suitcase fall free. Then he felt dirt piling down on top of it. It wasn't a huge cave-in. As he knelt down the hole, he could try to only a small portion of the earth and collapse. He dug with his hands until he found the leather handle, and then he pulled the suitcase up and out of the dirt. I got it, he exclaimed. He was heavy. He handed it up to Zero. You did it, Zero said, taking it from him. We did it, said Stanley. He gathered his remaining strength and tried to pull himself out of the hole. Suddenly, a bright light was shining in his face. Thank you, said the warden. You boys have been a big help. Chapter 25. The beam of flashlight was directed away from Stanley's eyes and onto Zero's, who was sitting on his knees. The suitcase was on his lap. Mr. Brudensky was holding the flashlight. Mr. Sir stood next to him, with his gun drawn, pointing at the same direction. Mr. Sir was barefoot and bare-chested, wearing only his pajama bottoms. The warden moved toward Zero. She was in her bed clothes, wearing an extra-long T-shirt. Unlike Mr. Sir, however, she had it on her boots. Mr. Brudensky was only one fully dressed. Perhaps he was on guard duty. Off in the distance, Stanley could see two more flashlights, bobbing toward them in the darkness. He felt helpless in the hole. You boys arrived just in the nick of time, the warden started to say. She stopped talking and stopped walking when she slowly backed away. A lizard had crawled on top of the suitcase. Its big red eyes glowed in a beam of flashlight. Its mouth was open, and Stanley could see its white tongue moving in and out with its black teeth. Zero sat still as a statue. Second lizard crawled up over the side of the suitcase, stopped less than an inch away from Zero's little finger. Stanley was afraid to look and not afraid to. He wondered if he could try to scrap out of the hole before the lizard turned on him. He didn't want to cause any commotion. The second lizard crawled towards Zero's fingers and halfway up his arms. It occurred to Stanley that the lizards were probably on the suitcase when he handed it to Zero. There's another one, said Mr. Brudensky. He shone the flashlight on the box of frosted flakes, which lay on its side beside Stanley's hole. A lizard was crawling out of it. The light also illuminated Stanley's hole. He gleamed downward and forced himself to suppress a scream. He was standing in a lizard nest. He felt a scream explode inside him. He could see 6 lizards. The 3 on the ground, 2 on his left leg, and 1 on his right sneaker. He tried to remain very still, some of them crawling up the back of his neck. 3 other counselors approached the area. Stanley heard one say, "What's going?" and then whisper, "Oh my God." "What do we do?" asked Mr. Brudensky. "We wait," said the warden. "It won't be very long. At least we'll have a body to give that woman," said Mr. Brudensky. "She's going to ask a lot of questions," said Mr. Sir, "and this time we'll have an AG with her. Let her ask her questions," said the warden. "Just as long as I have the suitcase, I don't care what happens. Do you know how long?" Her voice trailed off, then started again. "When I was little, I watched my parents dig holes every weekend and holiday. When I got bigger, I had to dig too, even on Christmas." Stanley felt tiny claws dig into the side of his face, and the lizard pulled itself out of his neck and tried to pass his chin. "It won't be long now," said the warden. Stanley could hear his heartbeat. Each beat told him he was still alive, at least for one more second. Chapter 46. 500 seconds later, his heart was still beating. Mr. Brudensky screamed. The lizard, which had been in the cereal box, was springing toward him. Mr. Sir shot it in midair. Stanley felt the blast shatter the air around him. The lizard scurried frantically across his very still body. He did not flinch. The lizard ran across his closed mouth. He glanced at Zero, and Zero's eyes met his. Somehow they were both still alive. That at least for one more second, one more heartbeat. Mr. Sir lit a cigarette. "I thought you quit," said one of the other counselors. Well, sometimes sunflower seeds just won't cut it." He took a long drag of a cigarette. "I'm going to have nightmares for the rest of my life." "Maybe we should just shoot them," suggested Mr. Brudensky. "Woo," said the counselors. "The lizards or the kids?" Mr. Brudensky laughed grimly. "The kids are going to die anyway," he laughed again. "At least they got plenty of graves to choose from." "We got time," said the warden. "I've waited this long. I can't wait another few." Her voice trailed off. Stanley felt a lizard crawl in and out of his pocket. "We're going to keep our story simple," said the warden. "That woman's going to ask a lot of questions. The AG will most likely initiate an investigation. So this has happened." Stanley tried to run away in the night, fell in the hole, and the lizards got him. "That's it. We're not going to give them Zero's body. As far as anybody knows, Zero doesn't exist, like Mom said. We got plenty of graves to choose from." "Why would he run away if he knew he was getting released today?" said Mr. Brudensky. "Who knows? He's crazy. That was why he couldn't release him yesterday. He was delirious, and we had to keep watch over him, and he couldn't hurt himself or anybody else. She's not going to like it, said Mr. Rudensky. She's not going to like anything we tell her, said the warden. She stared at Zero at the suitcase. Why aren't you dead yet? She asked. Stanley only half listened and talked to the counselors. He didn't know who that woman was or AG meant. He didn't even realize they were initials. That sounded like one word, AG. His mind was focused on the tiny claws that moved up and down his skin through his hair. He tried to think about other things. He didn't want to die with the images of the warden, Mr. Sir, and the lizards etched into his brain. Instead, he tried to see his mother's face. His brain looking back on time when he was little, all bundled up in a snowsuit. He and the mother were talking hand in hand, mitten in mitten, when they both slipped on some ice and fell, rolled down the snow-covered hillside. They ended up in the bottom of the hill. He remembered he almost cried, but instead he laughed. His mother laughed, too. He could feel the same lightheaded feeling he felt then, dizzy. He rolled down the hill. He felt the sharp coldness of the snow against his ear. He could see flecks of snow in his mother's bright, cheery face. This is where he wanted to be when he died. Hey, caveman, guess what? Said Mr. Sir. We're in it. You're innocent after all. I thought you would like to know that. Your lawyer came to get you yesterday. Too bad you weren't here. The words meant nothing to Stanley, who was still in the snow. He and his mother climbed up the hill and rolled down again, this time on purpose. Later they had hot chocolate with lots of melted marshmallows. It's getting close to 4:30, said Mr. Brudensky. They'll be waking up. The wardens told the constables returned to their tents. She told them to give the campers breakfast and make sure they didn't talk to anyone. As long as they did that, as they were told, they wouldn't have to dig any more holes. If they walked, they would be severely punished. How could we say we'll be punished? One of the counselors asked. Let them use their imagination, said the warden. Stanley watched the counselors return to the tents, leaving only the warning Mr. Sir behind. He knew the warden didn't care whether the campers dug any more holes or not. He found what she was looking for. He glanced at Zero. Lizard was perched on his shoulder. Zero remained perfectly still except for his right hand, which was slowly shortened into a fist when he raised his thumb, giving Stanley a thumbs-up sign. Stanley thought back of what Mr. Sir had said to them earlier, and the bits of conversation he overheard. He tried to make sense of it. Mr. Sir had said something about a lawyer, but Stanley knew his parents couldn't afford a lawyer. His legs were sore from remaining rigid for so long. Standing still was more strenuous than walking. He slowly allowed himself to lean against the side of the hole. The lizards didn't seem to mind. Chapter 47. The sun was up and Stanley's heart was still beating. There was 8 lizards in the hole with him. Each one had exactly 11 yellow spots. The warden had dark circles under her eyes and a lack of sleep and lines across her forehead, and a face which seemed exaggerated in a stark morning light. Her skin looked blotchy. Satan, said Zero. Stanley looked at him, unsure if Zero had even spoken or if he had just imagined it. Why don't you go and see if you take the suitcase from Zero, the warden suggested. Yeah, right, said Mr. Sir. The lizards obviously aren't hungry, said the warden. Then you go get the suitcase, said Mr. Sir. They waited. Satan Lee, said Zero. Something time later, Stanley saw a tarantula crawl across the dirt, not too far from this hole. He had never seen a tarantula before, but there was no doubt about what it was. He was moving frantically, fascinated by it, as its big hairy body moved slowly and steadily along. Look, a tarantula, said Mr. Sir, also fascinated. I'd never seen one, said the warden, except in... Stanley suddenly felt a sharp sting in the side of his neck. The lizard hadn't bitten him, however. It was merely pushing it off. It left off Stanley's neck and pounced on the tarantula. The last Stanley saw of it was one hairy leg sticking out of the lizard's mouth. Not hungry, huh? Said Mr. Sir. Stanley tried to return to the snow, but it was harder to get there when the sun was up. As the sun rose, the lizards moved lower into the hole, keeping mainly in the shade. They were no longer on his head and shoulders, but moved down to his stomach, legs, and feet. He couldn't see any lizards but on Zero, but believed there were 2, between Zero's knees, shaded from the sun by the suitcase. How are you doing? Stanley asked quietly. He didn't whisper, but his voice was dry and raspy. My legs are numb, said Zero. I'm going to try to climb out of this hole, Stanley said. As he tried to pull himself up using just his arms, he felt a crawl dig into his ankle. He gently eased himself back down. Is your last name your first name backwards? Zero asked. Stanley stared at him in amazement. Had he been working on that all night? He heard the sound of approaching cars. Mr. Sir and the warden heard it as well. You think it's them? Asked the warden. It ain't Girl Scouts selling cookies, said Mr. Sir. He heard the cars come up to a stop and the doors opened shut. A little while later, he saw Mr. Brudensky and 2 strangers coming across the lake. One was a tall man in a business suit and a cowboy hat. The other was a short woman holding a briefcase. The woman had tried to take 3 steps for every 2 of them taken by the man. Stanley Yelnats, she called, moving out ahead of the others. I suggest you don't come any closer, said Mr. Sir. You can't stop me, she snapped, and took a second glance at him, wearing pajama pants and nothing else. We'll get you out of there, Stanley, she said. Don't worry. You worry. She appeared to be Hispanic, with straight black hair and dark eyes, as she spoke with a little bit of Mexican accent, trailing her R's. What in tarnation? The tall man exclaimed as he came up behind her. She turned on him. I'm telling you right now, if any harm comes to him, we'll be filing charges not only against Miss Walker and Camp Green Lake, but the entire state of Texas as well. Child abuse, false imprisonment, torture. The man was more than a head taller than she was, and was able to look directly over her as he spoke to the warden. How long have they been in there? All night, as you can see by the way they're dressed. They snuck into my cabin while I was asleep and stole my suitcase. I chased after them and they ran out here and I fell into the lizard's nest. I don't know what they're thinking. That's not true, Stanley said. Stanley, as your attorney, I advise you not to say anything, said the woman, until you and I have had a chance to talk in private. Stanley wondered why the warden lied about the suitcase and wondered who it legally belonged to. It was no one. He wanted to ask the lawyer if she really was his lawyer. It's a miracle they're still alive, said the tall man. Yes, it is, the warden agreed, with just a trace of disappointment in her voice. And they'd better come out of this alive, Stanley, the lawyer warned. This wouldn't have happened if you released them to me yesterday. It wouldn't have happened if he wasn't a thief, said the warden. I told him he could be set free today, and I guess he decided to try to take some of my valuables with him. He'd been delirious for the last week. Why didn't you release them when she came to you yesterday, the tall man asked. She didn't have a proper authorization, said the warden. I had a court order. I was not authenticated, said the warden said. Authenticated. It was signed by the judge who sentenced him. I need an authentication from Attorney General, said the warden. How do I know it's legitimate? The boys in my custody have proven themselves dangerous to society. Am I supposed to turn them loose anytime someone hands me a piece of paper? Yes, said the woman. It's a court order. Stanley has been hospitalized for the last few days, the warden explained. He's been suffering from hallucinations and delirium, ranting and raving. He was in no condition to leave. The fact that he was trying to steal from me from the day before he released proves. Stanley tried to climb out of the hole, using mostly his arms not to disturb the lizards too much. As he pulled himself up, the lizard moved downward, keeping in the sun's direct rays. He swung his legs up, over, and the last of the livers hopped off. Thank God, exclaimed the warden. She started toward him, then stopped. The lizard crawled out of his pocket and down his leg. Stanley was overcome by a rush of dizziness and almost fell over. He steadied himself when he reached down, took hold of Zero's arm, and helped him slowly to his feet. Zero still held the suitcase. The lizards, which had been hiding under it, scurried quickly into the hole. Stanley and Zero staggered away. The warden rushed to them. He shrugged Zero. Thank God you're alive, she said, as she tried to take the suitcase from him. He jerked it free. It belongs to Stanley, he said. I don't cause any more trouble, the warden warned. You stole it from my cabin and you've been caught red-handed. If I press charges, Stanley might have to return to prison. Now I'm willing, in view all circumstances, to. It's got his name on it, said Zero. Stanley's lawyer pushed past the tall man and have a look. See? Zero's shoulder. Stanley Yelnats. Stanley looked too. There's a big black letters. Was Stanley Yelnats. The tall man looked over his head to the other and the name of the suitcase. You say he stole it from your cabin. The warden stared in disbelief. That's It's impossible. She couldn't even say it. Chapter 48. They slowly walked back to camp. The tall man was the Texas Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer for the state. Stanley's lawyer was named Miss Morango. Stanley held the suitcase. He was so tired he couldn't think straight. He felt as if he was walking in a dream, not quite able to comprehend what was going on around him. They stopped in front of the camp office. Mr. Sir went inside to get Stanley's belongings. The Attorney General had told Mr. Budensky to get the boys something to drink and eat. The warden seemed as dazed as Stanley. You can't even read, he said to Zero. Zero said nothing. Miss Morango put a hand on Stanley's shoulder and told him to hang in there. He would be seeing his parents soon. She was shorter than Stanley, but somehow gave the appearance of being tall. Mr. Budensky returned with 2 cartons of orange juice and 2 bagels. Stanley drank the juice and didn't feel eating anything. Wait, the warden exclaimed. I didn't say they stole the suitcase. It's his suitcase, obviously, but he put my things from the cabin inside it. That isn't what you said earlier, said Miss Morango. What's in the suitcase? The warden asked Stanley. Tell us what's in it, and we'll open it and see. Stanley didn't know what to do. Stanley, as your lawyer, I advise you not to open your suitcase, said Mr. Morango. He has to open it, said the warden. I have the right to check the personal property of any of the detainees. How do I know there aren't drugs or weapons in there? He stole a car, too. I've got witnesses. She was nearly hysterical. He's no longer under your jurisdiction, said Stanley's lawyer. He's not been officially released, said the warden. Open the suitcase, Stanley. Do not open it, said Stanley's lawyer. Stanley did nothing. Mrs. Sir returned from the office of Stanley's backpack and clothes. The Attorney General handed Miss Morango a sheet of paper. You're free to go, he said to Stanley. I know you're anxious to get out of here, so if you want to keep the orange suit as a souvenir or burn it, whatever you want. Good luck, Stanley. He reached out a hand to shake, but Miss Morango hurried Stanley away. Come on, Stanley, she said. We have a lot to talk about. Stanley stopped and turned to look at Zero. You couldn't leave him there. Zero gave him a thumbs up. I can't leave Hector, Stanley said. I suggest we go, said his lawyer with a sense of urgency in her voice. I'll be okay, said Zero. His eyes shifted toward Mr. Brudensky to one side of him, then to the warden and Mr. Stern on the other. There's no reason I can do for your friend, said Miss Marengo. You were released pursuant to an order from the judge. They'll kill him, said Stanley. Your friend is not in danger, said the Attorney General. They're just going to investigation into everything that's happened here. For the present, I'm going to take in charge of the camp. Come on, Stanley, said his lawyer. Your parents are waiting. Stanley stayed where he was. His lawyer sighed. May I have a look at Hector's file? He asked. Certainly, said the Attorney General. Mrs. Walker, go get Hector's file. She looked at him blankly. Well? The warden turned to Mr. Brudensky. Bring me Hector Zeroni's file. He stared at her. Get it, she ordered. Mr. Brudensky went into the office. He returned a few minutes later and announced the file had apparently misplaced. The Attorney General was outraged. What kind of a camp are you running here, Miss Walker? The warden had nothing. She stared at the suitcase. The Attorney General assured Stanley's lawyer that he would get the records. Excuse me while I call my office. He turned back to the warden. I assume the phone works? He walked into the camp office, slamming the door behind him. A little while later, he reappeared and told the warden he wanted to talk to her. She cursed, then went inside. Stanley gave Zero a thumbs up. Caveman, is that you? He turned to see Armpit and Squid coming out of the rec room. Squid shouted back to the rec room. Caveman and Zero are out here. Soon all the boys of Group D had gathered around him and Zero. Good to see you, man, Armpit said, shaking his hand. We thought you'd been buzzard food. Stanley is being released today, said Mr. Brudensky. Way to go, said Magnet, hitting him on the shoulder. And you don't even get to take a step on a rattlesnake, said Squid. Even Zigzag shook Stanley's hand. Sorry about, It's cool, said Stanley. We had to lift the truck clear out of the hole, Zigzag told him. It took everybody in C, D, and E. We picked it right up. It was really cool, said Twitch. X-Ray was the only one who didn't come over. Stanley saw him hang back behind the others a moment, then returned to the rec room. Guess what, said Magnet, glancing at Mr. Brudensky. Mom says we don't have to dig any more holes. That's great, Stanley said. Will you do me a favor? Asked Squid. I guess, Stanley agreed, somewhat hesitantly. I want you to. He turned to Mr. Marengo. Hey, lady, you have a pen and paper I can borrow? She gave it to him, and Squid wrote down a phone number, which he gave to Stanley. Call my mom for me, okay? Tell her I said I'm sorry. Tell her Alan said he was sorry. Stanley promised he would. Now you will be careful out in the real world, said Armpit. Not everybody is as nice as us. Stanley smiled. The boys departed when the warden came out of her office. The Attorney General was right behind her. The office is having more difficulty locating Hector Zeroni's records, the Attorney General said. So, you have no claim to authority over him, said Mr. Marengo. I didn't say that. He's in the computer. We just can't access his records. It's like they've fallen through a hole in cyberspace. A hole in cyberspace, Mr. Marengo repeated. How interesting. When is his release date? I don't know. How long has he been here? Like I said, we can't. So what are you planning to do with him? Keep him confined indefinitely without justification while you go crawling back through black holes in cyberspace? The Attorney General stared at her. He was obviously incarcerated for a reason. Oh, and what reason was that? The Attorney General said nothing. Stanley's lawyer looked at Zero's hands. Come on, Hector, you're coming with us. Chapter 49. There was never used to be a yellow spotted lizard in the town of Green Lake. They didn't come from the area until the lake dried up, but the townsfolk had heard about the red-eyed monsters living in the desert hills. One afternoon, Sam, the Onion Man, and his donkey, Mary Lou, were returning onto his boat, with his anchored a little offshore. It was late in November. The peach trees had almost lost their leaves. Sam, someone called. He turned around to see three men running after him, waving their hats. He waited. Afternoon, Walter, Bo, Jesse. He greeted them as he walked up, catching their breath. Glad we caught you, said Bo. We're going rattlesnake nutting in the morning. We want to get some of your lizard juice, said Walter. I ain't scared of no rattlesnake, said Jesse, but I don't want to come across one of those red-eyed monsters. I seen one once, and that was enough. I knew about the red eyes, of course. I hadn't heard about the big black teeth. It was white tongues that got me, said Bo. Sam gave each man 2 bottles of pure onion juice. He told him to drink 1 bottle before going to bed that night, and then half a bottle in the morning, and then half a bottle around lunchtime. Are you sure this stuff works? Asked Walter. I'll tell you what, said Sam. If it doesn't, you can come back next week and I'll give you your money back. Walter looked around on shore, and Bo and Jesse laughed, and then Sam laughed too. Even Mary Lou let out a rare yee-haw. Just remember, Sam told the men before they left, it's very important you drink the bottle tonight. Got to get into your bloodstream. The lizards don't like onion blood. Stanley and Zero sat in the backseat of Miss Marengo's BMW. The suitcase lay between them. It was locked as they decided they'd let Stanley's father try to open it in his workshop. You don't know what's in it, do you? She asked. No, said Stanley. I don't think so. The air conditioning was on, but they drove with the windows open as well, because, no offense, but you boys really smell bad. Miss Moreno explained that she was his pet and attorney. I'm helping your father with the new product he's invented. He's happened to mention your situation, so I did a little investigating. Clyde Livingston sneakers were stolen sometime before 3:15. I found a young man, Derek Doone, who said that 3:20, you were in the bathroom fishing your notebook out of the toilet. 2 girls remember seeing you come out of the boys' restroom carrying a wet notebook. Stanley felt his ears redden. Even after seeing it had been through, the memory still caused him to feel shame. So, you couldn't have stolen them, said Miss Marengo. He didn't, I did, said Zero. You did what? Asked Miss Marengo. I stole the sneakers. Laura actually turned around while driving and looked at him. I didn't hear that, she said, and I advise you make sure I don't hear it again. What did my father invent? Stanley asked. Did he find a way to recycle sneakers? No, he's still working on that, explained Miss Marengo. But he invented a product that eliminates foot odor. Here, I've got a sample in my briefcase. I wish I had more. You two could bathe in it. He opened her briefcase with one hand, passed a small bottle back to Stanley. It had a fresh and somewhat spicy smell. He handed it to Zero. What's it called? Zero asked. We haven't come up with a name yet, said Miss Marengo. It smells familiar, said Zero. Peaches, right? Asked Miss Marengo. That's what everyone says. A short while later, both boys fell asleep. Behind them was a sky that turned dark, and the first time in over 100 years, a drop of rain fell into the empty lake. Part 3. Filling in the holes. Chapter 50. Stanley's mother insisted that there never was a curse. She even doubts whether Stanley's great-great-grandfather really stole a pig. The reader might find it interesting, however, that Stanley's father invented his cure for foot odor the day after the great-great-grandson of Elia Yelnats carried a great-great-great-grandson of Madame Zeroni up a mountain. The Attorney General closed at Camp Green Lake. Miss Walker, who was desperate need of money, had to sell the land, which had been in her family for generations. It was bought by a national organization dedicated to the well-being of young girls. In a few years, Camp Green Lake will become a Girl Scout camp. This is pretty much the end of the story. The reader probably still has some questions, but unfortunately, from here on in, the answers tend to be long and tedious. While Mrs. Bell, Stanley's former math teacher, might want to know percent change in Stanley's weight, the reader probably cares more about the change in Stanley's character and self-confidence. But those changes are subtle and hard to measure. There's no simple answer. Even the contents of the suitcase turned out to be somewhat tedious. Stanley's father pried it open in the workshop, and first everyone gasped at the sparkling jewels. Stanley thought he and Hector had become millionaires, but the jewels were poor quality, worth no more than $20,000. Underneath the jewels was a stack of papers that had once belonged to the first Stanley Yelnats. These consisted of stock certificates, deeds of trust, and promissory notes. They were hard to read and even more difficult to understand. Miss Marengo's law firm spent more than 2 months going through all the papers. They turned out to be a lot more valuable than the jewels. After legal fees and taxes, Stanley and Zero had received less than $1 million, but not a lot less. It was enough for Stanley to buy his family a new house with a laboratory in the basement, and for Hector to hire a team of private investigators. But it would be boring to go through all the tedious details for all the changes in their lives. Instead, the reader will be presented with one last scene, which took place almost a year and a half after Stanley and Hector left Camp Green Lake. You'll have to fill in the holes yourself. There was a small party at the Yelnats' house, except for Stanley and Hector. Everyone there was an adult. All kinds of snacks and drinks were set up on the counter, excluding caviar, champagne, and the fixings to make ice cream sundaes. A Super Bowl was on television, but nobody was really watching. It should be coming on at the next break, said Miss Marengo announced. A timeout was called in a football game, and a commercial came on the screen. Everyone stopped talking and watched. The commercial showed a baseball game. Amid the cloud dust, Clyde Livingston slid into the home plate, and the catcher caught the ball and tried to tag him out. Safe, shouted the umpire as he signaled his arms. The people at Stanley's house cheered, as if the run really counted. Clyde Livingston got up and dusted the dirt off his uniform. As he made his way back to the dugout, he spoke to the camera. Hi, I'm Clyde Livingston, but everyone knows this calls me Sweet Feet. Way to go, Sweet Feet, said another baseball player, slapping his hand. Besides being on television, Clyde Livingston was also sitting on a couch next to Stanley. But my feet weren't always this sweet. The television, Clyde Livingston said, as he sat down on the dugout bench. They used to smell so bad that nobody would sit near me in the dugout. They really did stink, said a woman sitting on the couch on the other side of Clyde. She held her nose with one hand and fanned the air with the other. Clyde shushed her. Then the teammate told me about sploosh, said the television Clyde. He pulled a can of sploosh out from under the dugout bench and held it up for everyone to see. I just spray a little on each foot every morning. Now I really do have sweet feet. Plus, I like the tingle. Sploosh, said the voice. A treat for your feet, made from all natural ingredients. It neutralizes odor causing fungi and bacteria. Plus, you'll like the tingle. Everyone at the party clapped their hands. He wasn't lying, said the woman who sat next to Clyde. How can he even be in the same room with his socks? The other people at the party laughed. The woman continued. I'm not joking. It was so bad. You've made your point, said Clive, covering her mouth with his hand. You looked back at Stanley. Will you do me a favor, Stanley? Stanley raised and lowered his left shoulder. I'm going over to get more caviar, said Clyde. Keep your hand over my wife's mouth. He patted Stanley on the shoulder as he rose from the couch. Stanley looked uncertainly at his hand, then Clive Livingston's wife. She winked at him. He felt himself blush and turned away toward Hector, who was sitting on the floor in front of an overstuffed chair. A woman sitting in the chair behind Hector was absent-mindedly fluffing his hair with her fingers. He wasn't very old, but her skin would look weathered, looked to do it. Almost like leather. Her eyes seemed wary, as if she had seen too many things in her life and she didn't want to see, and then smiled. Her mouth seemed too big for her face. Very softly she half sang, half hummed a song about her grandmother used to sing to her when she was a little girl. If only, the moon speaks no reply, reflecting the sun and all that's gone by. Be strong, my weary wolf, turn around boldly. Fly high, my baby bird, my angel, my only.